Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend. Caller, what if with another fiction? What if Deku was bitten by radioactive cider and became Spider-Man? Now, before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Let's see what the Schnee name really means. I'm more than just a name. HM. Then prove it. Weiss was losing. It didn't take a genius to figure that out. Despite being a part of one of the top first-year teams at Beacon Academy, having killed numerous Grimm throughout the school year, reaching the semifinals of the Vital Festival, and surviving the fall of Beacon, Weiss knew that she was outclassed. Despite her years of training with Mirtanaster, her multi-action dust rapier, Weiss stood no chance against a bandit with years of experience, especially one with the powers of the Spring Maiden. Still, that wouldn't stop Weiss from doing her best, fighting till her last breath, despite this ambush. She was a Schnee after all. As much as she hated what her family stood for, Weiss Schnee was a part of Team rwby first and foremost. She won't disappoint her teammates, and the remains of Team JNPR. The interior of Haven Academy had turned into a battlefield, Ruby, Yang, and the others facing off against their respective opponents. Running her finger along her blade, Weiss narrowed her eyes. The Adaljan etchings in Mirtanaster's blade turned orange, the color of the fire dust imbued in her blade's hilt. Hiya! Weiss swung Mirtanaster. A wave of flames aimed at Vernal, that stupid bandit using the powers of the Spring Maiden for selfish reason. Stupid Branwen bandits, stupid White Fang, stupid Cinder and her followers, stupid Lionheart the traitor. Most of all, stupid Salem for causing so much pain and suffering. Vernal simply jumped back, avoiding the flames. She fired a few shots from her crescent blade weapon, forcing Weiss to switch to ice dust. Forming a glyph right in front of her, Weiss stabbed the ground, forming a wall of ice that managed to block Vernal's bullets. This was bad. This was really bad. Weiss aimed Mirtanaster at the ground again, forming another glyph, the snowflake having the pattern of a familiar sword. The Arma Gigas could help Weiss turn the tide. It was strong enough to face a Queen Lancer, so it should be strong enough to help her fight a maiden. Armored arms pulled themselves out of the glyph. The knightly armor of the Arma Gigas rose from the white snowflake. Suddenly, yellow lasers sliced through the ice wall, decapitating the half-formed Arma Gigas in the process. Damn it! Weiss mumbled under her breath. She barely rose Mirtanaster in time to block a strike from Vernal's crescent blade. Did you think I was going to let you take the easy way out? The Branwen second in command growled. Weiss only glared in return and formed a black glyph, this one pushing her away from the fallen Spring Maiden. Vernal threw one of her blades towards Weiss, forcing her to use another glyph to deflect the strike. Vernal caught her weapon easily and started firing, Mirtanaster easily being able to deflect several of the bullets. Using a glyph to launch herself in the air, Weiss dodged a few of Vernal's bullets, using Mirtanaster to deflect those she couldn't dodge. Gracefully landing back on the ground, Weiss stabbed the ground again, forming her summoning glyph. Only an arm was formed when Vernal suddenly struck, both of her crescent blades locking with Mirtanaster's blade. You should have focused on fighting me instead of trying that trick again. Vernal boasted when she unleashed a barrage of lasers straight into Weiss' chest at point-blank range. Weiss was sent flying through the air, and she struck the ground hard, her aura shattering upon impact. Gritting her teeth as her blue aura disappeared, Weiss used Mirtanaster to force herself upon her knees. That was definitely going to leave a bruise, until her aura returned at least. No! Weiss heard John scream from across the commons. Before she could turn, Weiss gasped. Something had pierced her side. Feeling her eyes widen in pain, Weiss struggled to breathe. Looking at the golden spear that had impaled her, Weiss had never felt this much pain before in her life. Not even the training exercise that gained her a scar over her left eye caused her this much pain. The golden spear disappeared, leaving a bloody hole in her side, and the last thing Weiss saw as the floor rushed to meet her was darkness. You take Yama. better known to the public as MT, Lady, was bored. Patrol was fun half of the time, but the other half was extremely boring. Well, it was certainly much better than hanging out at her agency building. The rising hero didn't really have any sidekicks as of yet, but that was something she could fix in the future. At least the paparazzi took plenty of good pictures. That could help boost her ratings. At the rate she was going, MT Lady would soon become a household name. Those sponsorships would come flooding in once she managed to slide herself into the top 10. Hero insurance was starting to become expensive, especially with all of the damage that her quirk caused. Shinji was never going to let her hear the end of it, always talking about responsibility and other boring stuff. Ignoring the stares of her dedicated fans as she flashed a few winks and a couple suggestive poses towards those who had cameras, something caught MT Lady's eyes. A bright flash of blue appeared near the mouth of an alleyway, not even a few feet away. "Excuse me." MT Lady formed a smirk as she grew a few inches. Walking through the crowd, MT Lady turned into the alleyway, when she suddenly paused. Laying in a small pool of blood was a teenage girl with hair as white as snow. Somebody call an ambulance. Today just turned out to be a lot less boring. The blood was going to be a bitch to get out of her costume, though. It would be worth it, as long as the girl survived, which she would. MT Lady was here to the rescue after all. And I've had this idea in my head for a few days now. It's my second attempt at writing a rwby story and my first attempt at MHA story, so any advice would be appreciated. Weiss is my favorite character, so I hope to be able to do her character justice. I don't have much experience with fight scenes, but I'll do my best to make them enjoyable. Fun fact: the first draft of this story would have dropped Weiss into the Worm universe, ending up in Brockton Bay. We'll talk more about Mirtenaster's dust next time. Detective Tsukachi was a very busy man. Being a walking lie detector meant more than a few cases came across his desk, and even more had to be investigated in the field. This time would be no different according to his briefing. MT Lady found a young girl bleeding to death in an alley, age about 14 or 15, wearing a blue dress that seemed to be a size or two too big for her. Such an occurrence wouldn't have batted an eye from an emergency worker or any other police officer, except for the other pieces of evidence. The girl's injuries were quite extensive. She had an old, nasty-looking scar over her left eye. It stuck out even more when compared to her pale white skin. It didn't look like it was caused by an accident. Tsukachi leaned against the hospital's wall. The girl was currently in the operating room, with doctors whose quirks best suited this situation. That gaping hole in her side. From what he heard from the nurses, the girl was lucky that none of her vital organs were hit by whatever caused it. Bullets were too small and wouldn't cause a neat hole like the one she had. That left melee weapons, or perhaps someone's quirk. The weird-looking sword revolver that was found alongside the white-haired girl had been the first suspect weapon, but that was discarded once Tsukachi held the sword in his hand. The blade was too skinny, and the metal itself had strange markings from a language that Tsukachi didn't recognize. It was also obvious that the sword wasn't made for just anyone. Its grip was too big for Tsukachi's hands, so it most likely belonged to the white-haired girl. It did match her outfit too, which helped to support that theory. She's still in there? Tsukachi didn't need to turn around to know that it was MT Lady who was speaking to him. Tsukachi turned his head slightly. It seemed that she went back to her agency to change into a cleaner, less bloody costume. Yes. The nurse said that they're finishing up. She lost a lot of blood, but she'll live. She was lucky you found her when you did. Tsukachi pulled out his notepad which held his notes. Once she's stable, they're going to run an X-ray to see if she has a quirk or not. Then we'll see if we can find her parents or a guardian. He already sent a sample of the girl's DNA back to the station since she didn't have any contact information on her. She did have a weird box on her that seemed a bit like a phone. But forensics didn't want to risk breaking it, so they gave it back to Tsukachi, who placed it in a box alongside the weird sword. Said box was now sitting on the chair next to him. The rising heroine seemed to preen at his words. That's good. We almost lost her in the ambulance a few times. She must have a strong will to live. Tsukachi nodded slightly as he adjusted the fedora that sat on his head. His phone started ringing, the vibrations causing it to shake in his pocket. Please excuse me for a second. Let me know if the doctor has any updates, Tsukachi said. Empty. Lady simply gave him a mock salute. Walking out of any bystander's hearing range, he answered the call. True man here. Forensics got back to me on that DNA you sent in. Tamakawa's voice answered. The cat-headed man was a good officer, and he knew when to not ask questions. She's not in any of our systems. In fact, we cross-referenced with the Koreans, Russians, and Americans while we were at it since you said she didn't look Japanese. None of them reported any missing white-haired girls. Tsukachi's eyes narrowed. That is not what he was expecting. Was she a victim from one of the remaining Yakuza families? That could explain why she didn't exist in their records. But what about her wounds? Hopefully the doctor had a better explanation about that. I see, thank you. Make sure this stays out of the chief's desk. You know how he gets whenever a half-assed report reaches him. Of course, sir. With that, Tsukachi said his farewells and ended the call. What was the deal with the mysterious girl? MT. Lady reported seeing a blue light when she found her. Was that the use of a teleportation quirk? Was she an illegal immigrant? There were more questions than there were answers, just like every other case Tsukachi worked on. Making his way back to MT, Lady allowed him to gather his thoughts. Any good news, MT? Lady sat next to the box with the white-haired girl's possessions, minus the bloody dress. Tsukachi shook his head. She doesn't exist in any of our records, and there aren't any search warrants out for her. MT. Lady cursed under her breath, something that Tsukachi couldn't catch. So what does that mean? Tsukachi shrugged. He would need more information to complete the picture. It means she's either the victim of a trafficking ring, or she's an illegal immigrant. Tsukachi wouldn't reveal any other theories he had. This was police business now. Or she's from a different dimension. MT. Lady blurted out, which earned her a raised eyebrow. Yeah, right. There's no way that was right. Weiss felt weak. Not that weakness she felt when she couldn't do anything as Beacon fell, or when father decided to take her back to Atlas. She physically felt very weak. Weiss groaned softly as she kept her eyes shut tight. What happened? Did they win? Did they lose? Ruby! Weiss' eyes opened, only to be blinded by a white light. She closed her eyes again quickly. It seemed that her aura hadn't returned yet, judging by how sore she felt. Opening her eyes slowly, Weiss was momentarily blinded until her eyes adjusted to the brightness. She was sitting in what seemed to be a hospital room, the door sitting to the right of the bed where she laid. Weiss attempted to sit up, only for a sharp pain to stop her in her tracks. Yup, her aura definitely wasn't back to 100 still. Wait a minute, where was everyone? Where was Ruby? Young? Hell, where was John? Sure, she might have been mean to them sometimes, but would they really leave her alone while injured? Weiss narrowed her eyes as she slowly forced herself into a sitting position. She looked down at her hospital gown. It was a design that seemed to be a mixture of Mistralian and Vale cultures. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, revealing a young woman wearing a nurse outfit. Who are you and where am I? Weiss demanded, her voice speaking in Atlassian that always felt familiar on her tongue as soon as the nurse's eyes met hers. The nurse tilted her head in confusion. I don't speak German. I'll go and let the doctor know that you're awake, the nurse said in Mistralian. She left as soon as she finished speaking. Weiss growled softly. Some nurse that was. But at least she confirmed that she was still in Mistral. Learning the languages of each of the four kingdoms was not a waste, as Young tended to say. One's education must always be balanced. Wait just a second. What's German? And I'm not all caught up with rwby. I took a break once volume came out, and I'm currently watching season of MHA in preparation for the next season. Now about the dust in Mir Tenaster. I believe it was confirmed that dust doesn't work once it leaves remnant, and several of Weiss glyphs require dust in order to work. If I remember right, Weiss time dilation glyph requires lightning dust in order to work. I might have to change the way dust works in order for that to work. Now Weiss won't be able to shoot ice like she did against the Queen Lancer. But I want her to be able to use her basic glyphs. After the rude nurse left, Weiss was left alone to her devices. Naturally, if this was one of Cinder's plots, Weiss wasn't going to take it sitting down. Whoever these people were, they were not about to take Weiss as a hostage. Even with her losing her position as heir to the Schnee Dust Company, Weiss was still a Schnee. Father would just pay the ransom to punish her himself. Weiss' eyes darted around the room. While it may seem like a normal hospital room, who knows what hiding beneath each counter or desk? Weiss touched her side, feeling the bandages beneath her hospital gown. Yup, it seemed that someone got a lucky hit on her once her aura was down. If only she had her scroll on her. Being able to see her aura level would allow Weiss to plan an escape using her glyphs. Of course, finding Mir Tenaster would have to be next on her top list of priorities. The door opened again, revealing that rude nurse, this time accompanied by an older man wearing a white lab coat. They both had some type of name tag on them, but it was in a language that Weiss didn't understand, which was surprising. "Can you understand me?" the doctor said in Mistralian. He took out what seemed to be an older scroll and pressed a few buttons. He spoke again, but more hesitantly. "Or do you understand me with this language?" He said that last sentence in Atlassian. Weiss rolled her eyes. He had butchered every word in that sentence. "I can understand you just fine." Weiss replied in Mistralian before he could butcher her native language any more than he already has. While she preferred speaking in Atlassian when alone or at home, she could easily speak to her friends in Valish, which served as trade language for all of the four kingdoms for some reason. The perks of knowing multiple languages ensured that she always knew what people were saying about her. The doctor shared a glance with the rude nurse. "My apologies. Your Japanese is pretty good," the doctor said while forming a smile on his face. Weiss only glared in response. What the hell was Japanese? That sounded like something Young would have been into. "I'm Dr. Miura, and this is Nurse Hayashi." He motioned towards the rude woman from earlier, who also gave Weiss a warm smile. She didn't trust them. Something bad happened at Haven. Otherwise Ruby, Yang, John, or even Ren and Nora would have been here already. Ruby would have been here before the doctor, attempting to break Weiss' ribs. "May I ask your name?" Now that was very insulting. While Weiss may have been known as the heir, now former, to the Schnee Dust Company, she also was a very popular singer throughout the kingdoms. Every single one of her concerts never had an empty seat, for crying out loud. Her last album stayed at the top of the charts for weeks. Weiss seethed inside, but she forced herself to swallow her pride. Exposing herself wouldn't do her any good if they were kidnappers or working with Salem. Ruby rose. Weiss said confidently, the Mistralian translation of her partner's name easily leaving her lips. "We shall see if that's true," someone else said, the voice coming from the door. Weiss glared at the intruder once they made themselves known. Walking through her hospital room's door was a tall man dressed in an oversized trench coat with a fedora. The man's face was impassive, not showing a single bit of emotion. "And who are you supposed to be?" Weiss said sarcastically. He looked important, but how did he know she was lying? Was that his semblance? "I'm Detective Tsukachi from the National Police Agency." He pulled a small notepad from one of his many pockets. Oh, so he was a member of the police then. That was worse than dealing with the hospital staff here. The detective exchanged a glance with Dr. Miura. I have several questions for you once the good doctor is done giving you an examination. Was he one of Lionheart's goons? She did just survive an ambush laid by the traitorous headmaster. Still, there was a chance that he could have been one of the few huntsmen that was on their side. Either way, Weiss didn't like him. Very well. Weiss could play along for now, or at least until Mitenaster was back in her possession. Dr. Miura and the rude woman who should not have been a nurse were much more annoying than Weiss expected them to be. Not John trying to ask her out on a date every 5 minutes annoying, but extremely so. They kept asking her how many fingers they held up, and the rude woman's index finger started to glow at one point, having Weiss follow the light with her eyes. A weird, if a bit useless when it came to semblances. None could compare to the hereditary glyphs of the Schnee family, of course. Combine that with her swordsmanship, Weiss was sure she could easily escape should the need arise. Thankfully, her aura returned when the doctor and nurse weren't looking, covering Weiss' body in that comforting blue color before disappearing. Now that stab in her side was a dull ache instead of causing her extreme pain. Dr. Miura examined her wound and replaced the old, blood-covered bandages with new ones. As much as Weiss hated to admit it, they did a pretty decent job. Not as good as the Atlas professionals that would clear an entire floor just for her, but passable. Make sure you don't agitate the wound, otherwise your stitches are going to open up. It'll leave a faint scar, but I'm sure that's better than being dead. Dr. Miura's failed attempt as a joke only earned him a glare from Weiss. He coughed into his fist awkwardly. I'm afraid we couldn't do much about the scar on your left eye. It's okay. It was Weiss' choice to keep that scar. Father was livid, and Mother was a bit too drunk to care or show what she thought. She didn't regret it, of course. Seeing Father's angry face made blemishing her pale, perfect face worth it. What was one more scar? Thank you. Dr. Miura smiled in return. Do you need anything before we send Detective Tsukachi in? What did she need? A mirror would be nice. Even wounded and stuck in a hospital bed, Weiss still needed to keep up her physical appearance. A mirror would suffice. Nurse Hayashi nodded. I'll see what I can do. I'm sure I can find one somewhere. The two said their farewells and left soon after. They didn't seem like they worked for Cinder, but Weiss wouldn't let her guard down. Cinder, Emerald, and Mercury had fooled them all when they infiltrated Beacon. Weiss wouldn't be fooled again. She was taken out of her thoughts by Nurse Hayashi, who returned with a small handheld mirror. Here, I know how much you youngsters love taking care of your appearances. I'm sure you have more than a few guys or girls going after your heart. The still rude woman said as she handed Weiss the mirror. While Weiss was relatively young, that was still a weird thing to say. She was of age to attend one of the best academies for huntsmen and huntresses, and Nurse Hayashi only seemed a few years older than Weiss. Most likely around Winter's age if Weiss had to guess. Thank you, Weiss said politely, keeping her face neutral. Nurse Hayashi gave her a wink and left Weiss to her devices. Weiss sighed as she leaned back, her aura finally working on her injury. Finally. Weiss muttered under her breath as she held the mirror up to her face. Yup, same old scar, same light blue eyes, same. What was this? Weiss' eyes widened in shock as her hand that held the mirror started to shake slightly. That wasn't possible. Was this one of Professor Ozpin's schemes? He did manage to turn Ruby's uncle and Yang's mom into birds. Yes, that must be why they weren't here. Weiss must have volunteered for some special mission. That's right, there was no other explanation for this. Why else would she look younger than Ruby? And, ahaha, I deged Weiss to make her fit into Yua. Anyways, I thought about it. And it would be easier to let dust work in the MHA universe. Weiss is just going to have to use it sparingly until she can find out how to get some more. Yeah, what Sakachi did was kinda stupid. Shorter chapters are my usual style, but I'll try to make them longer if possible. No promises. My readers that came over from my worm stories should be used to it by now. Now, shall other rwby characters show up? Perhaps in the future, but not at the moment. Shipwise, I'm still undecided on that as well, but suggestions are always welcomed. Just don't be mad if your ship doesn't happen. Weiss allowed her hand to drop, the mirror landing in her lap undamaged. What the hell was going on here? First Ruby and the others don't even bother to show up. Someone took Mirtanaster along with her other belongings. Those earrings were made out of the purest dust. And now she looked like she could be Whitley's little sister. At least she stopped growing around this age, if only gaining an inch or two right before being accepted into Beacon. Weiss was definitely going to need a new pair of heels once she got out of here. Right after she tore into Ruby for not being here as soon as she woke up. The door opened, revealing Detective Tsukachi from earlier, and a woman dressed in an outfit that would make even Young blush, with weird purple horns. Weiss narrowed her eyes, stealing her features. Never reveal anything that could be used against you in the future. That was one of the first lessons Father taught her. And as much as she hated to admit it, Father's lessons would serve her well as she dealt with this man and possible huntress. Good afternoon. He took a seat that was next to Weiss Hospital. As I said earlier, my name is Detective Tsukachi from the National Police Agency, and this is MT. Lady. She is the hero that found you and brought you to the hospital. The detective pulled the same notebook from his pocket. The huntress gave Weiss a warm smile, before suddenly grabbing her with a death grip, throwing her arms around Weiss' smaller shoulders before the white-haired girl could even say a word. I'm so happy that you're okay. I almost lost you a few times in the ambulance on the way here. Weiss struggled to keep her blush down as her face was pressed into the strange woman's bosom. She can't breathe. Using her aura to strengthen her muscles, Weiss was about to force the wanton huntress off of her when Detective Tsukachi spoke. You're going to reopen her wound if you don't let go. Oops, sorry, MT. Lady blushed as she wiped a few tears off of her face. Weiss felt a damp spot on her shoulder, causing her to seethe inside. Who was this woman to touch her without permission? If only she had Mirtanaster, she could run that woman through. My apologies. Detective Tsukachi interrupted Weiss' plans for murder as he took the seat that sat next Weiss' hospital bed. He glared at the promiscuous woman. MT. Lady requested that she be allowed in the meeting since she was the hero on the scene that found you. I see. Weiss eyed the huntress. Thank you for helping me in my time of need. Being polite could help Weiss score some points. Points she could use to regain her belongings. You're welcome. If MT. Lady was a bird, Weiss was sure that she would be showing off her feathers. I just did what any hero would do. Now the lady was pushing it. Did she save Weiss' life? According to everyone here, she did. But what about the doctors and nurses who also did their part? Calling herself a hero was pushing the limit. Now, I would like to ask you a few questions. Could you answer them to the best of your abilities? Detective Tsukachi asked. MT. Lady took a seat on the other side of Weiss' bed. Of course. Weiss replied. She just had to be careful of what she revealed or concealed. This could be a long scam, with the doctor, nurse, and this detective being scammers that were trying to siphon information out of Weiss. Thank you. Detective Tsukachi said. His eyes met Weiss' blue ones. What's your name? Ruby Rose. Weiss answered immediately. Detective Tsukachi scratched something out of his notes, and he rubbed his forehead slowly. Hey kid, I hope you know that my quirk lets me know when someone is lying. He leaned back in his chair. I want to help you, but I'm going to need your full cooperation. Now please, what's your name? Weiss' eyes turned into pinpoints. Why did he call his semblance a quirk? Perhaps her brain made an error when translating. Yeah, right. Weiss never made mistakes that were well within an area of control. KriegSchnee. Weiss almost growled through closed teeth. Detective Tsukachi nodded and went back to writing in his notebook. You have a pretty name. MT. Lady interrupted. Weiss only smirked in response. Of course her name was pretty. A beautiful name for a beautiful huntress in training. Thank you, Weiss said. This time her politeness was genuine. It was a bit strange that they haven't recognized her yet. How far away from civilization were they? Why was this lady wearing such an ugly and form-fitting costume? No, Weiss was not jealous. She was a Schnee, and she loved herself. Your Japanese is pretty good. Nurse Hayashi informed me that you also spoke German. Are you from around here? The detective asked. There were those two words again, Japanese and German. Was that what they called Mistralian and Atlassian around here? Was she in a village that was so cut off from the rest of the four kingdoms that they had a different name for languages? That could explain why they called Weiss Atlassian German earlier. Thank you. And that would depend on what or where here exactly is. Weiss responded. She wasn't going to give this man her whole life story and how her tutors hammered all those languages into her head. Detective Tsukachi raised an eyebrow, an act that Weiss mirrored with one of her own. He turned his attention to his notebook and wrote something down silently. It took all of Weiss' self-restraint to stop herself from grinding her teeth. You're in the Republic of Japan, more specifically Musatafu, Shizuoka Prefecture. Those names sounded foreign to Weiss' ears. She had never heard of such a place, which definitely meant that she was deep in Mistral's countryside. And where in the Four Kingdoms is that? Detective Tsukachi was in the middle of writing something down when he paused, his inexpressive eyes now wide. He turned to MT, lady whose eyes were also as wide as his were. Let's see if we can find a map. Detective Tsukachi had seen many things in life that could be called weird. Stepping outside of the room briefly with MT, lady, he asked a nearby nurse if she could bring him a map, or even a world globe if possible. What do you think, MT? Lady asked quietly. He gave her a side glance. Talking to Weiss directly managed to disprove some of his original theories. I believe that her mind is too alert, especially since she was stuck in a coma for 2 days. Tsukachi gave his notes a brief look. The X-ray indicates that she's also quirkless judging by her joints, and after looking at her belongings again, I don't believe she may be an illegal immigrant. Her bloody dress looked expensive, as well as the jewels that she was found with. The possibility that she's a victim of a trafficking ring has just risen. Or perhaps she comes from a rich family, and she was kidnapped in order to extort money from her family. Except no search warrants were out for a white-haired girl, which immediately killed that theory. The surgeon's medical report said that parts of her wound were already cauterized, mostly around the edges. Was she one of Endeavor's? Most likely a no, since Weiss didn't seem to have a single bit of Japanese in her. I see. MT. Lady placed a finger on her chin. The nurse soon returned with a foldable map of the world. Tsukachi took it after quickly saying thanks. Walking back into the room, Tsukachi walked up to Weiss' bed and carefully unfolded the map, placing it on her lap. She gave him a weird look, but quietly turned her attention to the map. Tell me, do you recognize any of these countries? Weiss' eyes darted all over the map, her features darkening. Tsukachi wrote down a few notes as MT. Lady easily looked over his shoulder. Stop pulling my leg and bring out a real map. Weiss grumbled angrily. Wait, what? If this is a prank, I hope you know it's not a funny one. Did Yang put you up to this? Tsukachi felt his eyes widen as MT. Lady's jaw practically fell to the floor in shock. That was not the reaction he was expecting. Weiss' eyes darted between the two adults in front of her. What were they confused about? They were the ones who brought out such a fake-looking map after all. Ha, the names of some of these countries were pretty funny. The United States of America. Who's America? Why did so many countries have republic in their name? Weiss shrugged internally. None of that really mattered. She just needed to get out of here and find the rest of her team. I assure you that this map is real. In fact, it's last year's edition, so it should be up to date. Detective Tsukachi said with a frown. Weiss' lips turned into a thin line as she glared back at him. Yang must have paid them quite a bit of money if this was a prank. Are you sure you don't recognize any of these countries? He pointed at one of the continents that the map called Europe, its wording written in neat Valish. Weiss humored the man and gave the fake map a glance. Nope, nothing on there seemed familiar. Why did that one country look like a boot? Yep, definitely a prank. I'm positive. Detective Tsukachi shared another look with MT. Lady. Were they disappointed that their prank failed? Well, they should be. It was the worst prank Yang had ever tried pulling on Weiss. I see. What was the last thing you remembered? Detective Tsukachi placed the notebook back in his pocket. Empty. Lady tried fishing it out, but a light slap to her hand stopped her. Any event would work. Weiss bit the inside of her cheek. If they were actors, they should seriously consider going to those award shows Whitley liked watching. But why hadn't she spotted any cracks? Weiss was proud of her ability to read people. It allowed her to know who wanted to be her friend just to advance their own social status, and what boys tried winning her heart just because she was pretty. Was it obvious that Weiss didn't have any friends before going to Beacon? Me and my friends were ambushed by bandits, Weiss said. They didn't need to know all of the details like Professor Lionheart's betrayal and Weiss fighting that rogue spring maiden. I remember something piercing my side here. Weiss glanced toward her bandaged side. Thankfully, her aura was dulling most of the pain. She should be fine in a few hours. Everything afterwards is just a blur. MT. Lady's eyes started tearing up. You poor, poor child. She looked like she wanted to give Weiss another hug, but a sharp glare quickly shut that idea down. Weiss didn't like it when strangers touched her. Do you remember anything defining about them? Detective Tsukachi asked, his eyes softening a little. Weiss softened her glare and took a deep breath. She couldn't lie, not with this man's semblance in effect. I remember their leader wielding a sword. Yang's mom did wield some makeshift weapon, being able to switch blades in its sheath if Weiss' guess was correct. She was strong, being more than a match for Kuro, Yang and Ruby's usually drunk uncle. Detective Tsukachi remained silent for a few seconds, the light from the fading sun slowly turning orange. Please excuse me for a few minutes. He quickly left the room, leaving Weiss alone with the strange huntress. I like your hair. MT. Lady said casually, leaning forward in her seat, her purple eyes scanning Weiss' form. She ran her hands through her long, blonde hair. You must take great care of it. Weiss nodded, her pride already starting to rise. Perhaps she overreacted earlier when she was ready to spill the huntress guts. These people had been nothing but kind to Weiss, unless they were hiding the fact that they knew she was a Schnee. Still, it wouldn't hurt to be polite in return. Weiss' hair was down and in need of her daily brush, so she was obviously lying. Thank you. Weiss gave MT. Lady's outfit a quick glance. The fabric looked like it could easily tear. Not really useful when it came to fighting Grimm. But Weiss didn't have any right to complain about MT. Lady's wardrobe. Her own literally consisted of various dresses and combat skirts. I like your horns. MT. Lady gave her a large grin. Thank you. I designed them myself. It should help me stand out, you know? She ran a finger along the outline of her purple mask, which connected to the horns. Plus, it keeps my hair out of my face. That seems useful. It is. Any further conversation was interrupted by the return of Detective Tsukachi, who held a long box in his hands. Closing the door behind him, He placed the box on Weiss' bed, near her feet. Opening the box slowly, the top folded upwards, blocking Weiss' view. Noticing his mistake, the detective changed the direction the box faced. Weiss' eyes widened in shock, with a large grin taking over her face. Mirten asked her, along with the rest of her belongings. Her scroll, her purse that held extra vials of dust, the tiara that held Weiss' hair in place when she tied her hair into a ponytail, and even dress she wore during the Battle of Haven. A large hole in the side she was struck. Is this the blade that their leader used? Detective Tsukachi asked. Weiss shook her head. No, that's my sword. Just like Ruby said, their weapons were an extension of themselves. Without Mirten, Weiss felt naked and defenseless, like she was missing a part of her very soul. Empty. Lady's eyes seemed to grow. That's your sword? And you know how to use it? Of course I do. I designed her myself. Weiss smirked. Every groove, every Atlassian marking that was carved on Mirten blade was created to Weiss specifications. Mirten was the perfect weapon, especially when paired with the Schnee's glyphs. Both adults stared at Weiss in shock, with confusion slowly overtaking their features. MT, lady, may I speak to you in private? Detective Tsukachi said slowly. MT. Lady nodded slowly as she got up from her seat. The detective turned his attention back to Weiss. I'm not usually allowed to do this since your belongings are still considered evidence, but I'll leave them here in your keeping as a sign of good faith. Weiss nodded, trying and failing to keep her excitement off of her face. Detective Tsukachi left right after, leaving Weiss alone with a comforting silence. Quickly grabbing her scroll, Weiss powered up the device after inserting her passcode. Thankfully, it still had some power, and she never went anywhere without her charger. Scrolling through her contacts, Weiss pressed on the one that had a red rose as a contact photo. Calling Doofus. The scroll's screen rang for exactly 1 second, and the message that came afterwards caused her heart to sink. Caller not in range. Weiss' hands wouldn't stop shaking, no matter how hard she tried. What was going on? Was Ruby out of range? But that wasn't possible. Unless Mistral's CCT was taken down at the same time as the Battle of Haven, communications shouldn't be done. Weiss' heart stopped for a second. She pressed the call button again. Caller not in range. Her fingers started to shake as she scrolled through her contacts. She tapped on the one with a large yellow flame, this one named Doofus Honid's comedy classes. Taking a deep breath to control her emotions, Weiss pressed the call button. It rang for exactly 1 second when a message popped up on the scroll screen. Caller not in range. Oh no, hundreds of thoughts flew through Weiss' brain. Did her friends leave her behind as they continued on their quest? Was she really that injured during the battle? Did something happen to them? Weiss found Blake's contact, pressing on the picture of Blake, holding a nice tea set Weiss had given her after they got back from break. She held her breath as a shaky finger touched the call button, tears starting to form in the corner of her eyes. Caller not in range. Weiss felt her tears fall onto the hospital gown she wore. The calls to John, Ren, and Nora ended the same way. Caller not in range. Did they block her? Did her friends abandon her? Did they not love her as much as she loved them? She allowed a soft whimper to escape as she pulled her knees to her chest. Weiss truly was alone. Mirror, tell me something. The single that shot Weiss' music career all the way to the top. Father only gave her a scowl once he heard the news. He didn't even bother listening to any of the songs. And if he did, the lyrics surely didn't bother him. Father probably thought of it as a PR tactic, to use his heir to boost his credentials among the SDC's younger consumers. How fitting it was. Tell me who's the loneliest of all. A lonely heiress. What a horrible lie everyone must have thought. Lonely. With all of that wealth at her fingertips. Those lyrics were probably written by someone else. Why would a Schnee be lonely? just buy some friends, she could certainly afford that. Weiss had heard the whispers, how people called her an attention seeker when the song first released. I'm the loneliest one of all. Weiss poured her feelings to each verse, the song slowly repeating itself in her head as she stared at the scroll in front of her. What would she do now? Weiss eyed the box that held Mirtanaster, her tears blinding her only a little bit. She didn't escape Atlas, escape father just because she was being a rebellious teenager. Her friends needed her. Ruby needed her. Young needed her. Blake needed her. And Weiss, she needed them. You couldn't spell Team RWBY without the W after all. Something must jave happen to them. Weiss' friends would never abandon her, and she would never abandon them. Weiss grabbed Mirtanaster and opened its hilt, revealing the dust tubes. She still had a decent amount of dust in the hilt itself, plus her purse had several vials that she always carried in case of an emergency. If things truly got desperate, the dust earrings Weiss wore and the extra vials could be used to create more. Normally such a process was more expensive than mining pure dust due to the need for an experienced person with aura. But an emergency was an emergency, and Weiss was a Schnee. She studied dust all of her life. Dust was the lifeblood of the Schnee family. Grabbing her purse and the rest of her belongings, Weiss took out the Roman 4 lines that were in her arms. The machine started making a weird noise, but a press of a button immediately silenced it. She saw one of the nurses messing with it earlier, tying the dress around her waist and slipping on her heels that were a little too big. Weiss jumped off of the bed and faced the window with a small stumble. The sun was almost done. She could easily escape into the darkness. Her eyes glanced towards the door, where Detective Tsukachi and MT Lady must have been on the other side. Hopefully they were good people. They seemed like they were. Weiss shook her head and took a deep breath. Closing her eyes, she formed a glyph beneath her feet. Running her right index finger along Mirtanaster's blade, another glyph formed behind her. She wasn't going to waste dust on trying to break that stupid window. Her aura and Mirtanaster could handle that. Opening her eyes, she released the breath, and the glyph shot her forward. Mirtanaster aimed straight at the glass. The Atlassian metal in Mirtanaster's blade easily broke the window, Weiss' aura protecting her from the broken shards of glass. Flying through the air, Weiss formed another glyph, which she jumped on, forming another ohm that softened her landing on a nearby rooftop of another section of the hospital. She gracefully turned around, 2 figures staring at her in shock from her former hospital room. Weiss felt a little bad, considering how much they helped her, and for the efforts the hospital workers put in that helped save her life. Thank you, Weiss shouted, waving her right hand in the air. It was the polite thing to do after all. She's not lying. Tsukachi sighed as soon as MT Lady closed the door behind her. The hero gave him a confused look, raising one of her eyebrows. What? Tsukachi rubbed his forehead. Everything she said there is true. She designed that sword. She was in an ambush, and she wasn't playing dumb when we showed her the map. Weiss truly believes everything that she said. MT Lady's mouth formed an O. So what does that mean? It means that either your theory about her being from a different dimension is correct, or she belongs in a mental asylum. Tsukachi whispered. And since we can't find her in any records, I'm leaning towards your idea. In a world with the internet, she should have been easy to find. MT Lady nodded slowly. Or she could have been locked up somewhere, designing support weapons for some nefarious organization. True, but there still should be some trace of her somewhere. Dr. Miura confirmed that white is her natural hair color, and while it's not extremely rare, it's also not that common. Tsukachi remained silent when a random nurse walked past them. So what's going to happen to her? MT Lady asked. Her eyes filled with worry turned towards the door. I'm afraid that's out of my pay grade. I imagine that the government will want to question her themselves, or worse, experiment on her. Best case scenario, She either ends up in a mental hospital or foster care. Quirks were weird. What's to say that there's one out there that could make interdimensional portals? The world had far weirder quirks, All Mights for example. But that wasn't Tsukachi's secret to tell. Experimentation? But she's just a little kid. They can't do that. MT. Lady raised her voice, only lowering it when Tsukachi shushed her. She looked around carefully before glaring at him. I know and I agree with you. But there's nothing I can do. Tsukachi looked away. It took a few favors to get her blood work done that fast. Plus, there's no place where she could stay. I'll take her in. Tsukachi's head never turned so fast. What? Are you sure? Raising a kid is no easy matter, especially when you're a hero. Plus, you have to pay for meals, clothes, and extra bills. MT. Lady nodded with a small smile on her face. I have plenty of room at my agency. It won't be much, but she'll have a roof over her head. Besides, you're talking to a future top 10 hero here. Money is not an issue. She pointed her thumb at herself. That was surprisingly generous of her. A far cry from the rather vain hero from earlier. I'll do what I can with the paperwork. I'm the only one working on this case, so I'm sure no one will notice if this is blamed on a random Yakuza family. Tsukachi pulled out his phone. It would take a lot of favors, but he could come up with some identification that should be real enough to pass even UA's security system. He had done his fair share of cover-ups before, and the chief didn't really care as long as he could come up with excuses to write warrants. He extended his hands towards MT. Lady. So we're in agreement then? Yup. As soon as MT. Lady shook his hand, a loud crash sounded from the room. Quickly bursting through the door, Tsukachi's eyes widened in shock. Weiss managed to break the window somehow and escaped. Carefully running over the glass, Tsukachi and MT. Lady could only stare in shock as Weiss jumped through the air, a large snowflake forming beneath her legs each time she jumped. She landed on the roof of another section of the hospital with such grace that only a professional ice skater could have. Slowly turning around, Weiss gave them a friendly wave. Thank you. Her voice was almost drowned out by the wind, but Tsukachi's ears caught it. Double was she taunting them? I thought you said that she was quirkless. Empty, Lady said, her voice cracking near the end. Tsukachi nodded silently as Weiss started running without even a limp. She was going to open her wound. Well, I'm glad I placed this on her. Tsukachi pulled out a small button from his pocket. It was made of a silver metal, the red light in the center blinking. He turned around, walking past the confused nurses that gathered near the door. You placed a tracker on her? Empty. Lady scoffed as she speed walked alongside him. Better safe than sorry. I have it connected to my phone. Contact someone you trust. We need to find her before she hurts herself or stabs someone. Tsukachi said. Hopefully Weiss didn't notice the tract in her haste to escape. He had slipped it on one of the hospital gown's buttons. Empty. Lady smirked when they entered the elevator. I know just who to call. 10 minutes into Weiss' escape, she started to regret not taking a few seconds to tie her hair into her signature ponytail. Every once in a while, right as she was about to jump off one of her glyphs, parts of Weiss' hair decided that it would be funny to cover her eyes. Stupid wind. This was why her bangs were kept shorter than the rest of her hair. Landing on another of her glyphs, Weiss finally managed to leave the hospital grounds, using her semblance to gracefully step on the concrete sidewalk. It seemed that the streets were mostly empty in this area, with lights only coming from a few restaurants. Hopefully nobody questioned the hospital gown she wore, but there was no time to worry about that. Without another glance, Weiss started running down the street. A quick glance at her scroll showed that her aura was still in the green levels, but Weiss still had to deal with that annoying injury in her side, and she didn't want to risk her glyphs disappearing midair because she pushed herself past her limits too soon. A few Australians gave her a few weird looks, but Weiss ignored them. Once she was far enough, she could buy a change of clothes using the lien she still had in her purse. Weiss would have preferred changing into her dress, but there was still a large hole in it that needed to be fixed, and she was a bit smaller now. She could always have another one made. Weiss ran past a man with a bush for a head. Wait, what? She paused, her feet practically skidding along the sidewalk. With wide eyes, she turned around and finally took a chance to look at the few people that were still out on the street. She rubbed her eyes and blinked a few times. Yup, that man she walked past had a bush for a head. Another person had 3 eyes, while another's head looked like his brain was exposed. And another person who gave her a weird look looked like he was entirely made of wood. While there were a few normal people, there were just as many people with features that blew Weiss' mind. Did someone at the hospital drug her before she escaped? Maybe they were actually Faunus and her mind was playing tricks on her. Weiss shook her head and was about to take another step when she felt a sudden urge to look towards the sky. Mirtanaster almost fell from her hand as her eyes widened. Releasing the breath that she didn't realize she was holding, Weiss fell to her knees. WI was the moon hole. This time Mirtanaster did fall to the ground, a loud clang filling the silent street, the full and unbroken moon shining its light down on Weiss' pale body. Grabbing her head, Weiss screamed her lungs out. Was she even on remnant? So you're after a girl who escaped from the hospital, who you saved after finding her bleeding to death in a hospital. And she's from a different dimension. Shinji, better known to the public as Kamui Wood, said through the phone. And you want me to help you find her? Yup. You said, making sure to pop the P at the end. Detective Tsukachi's eyes darted between the tracker and the road ahead of them. And keep that last piece of information to yourself. It's classified. Shinji sighed. I'll let you know if I see her. How does she look? She has white hair, light blue eyes, and a scar over her left eye. You replied as Detective Tsukachi took a left. They were going to split up, until you realized that unless she used her quirk to grow, she wasn't going to get much ground covered without gathering much attention. Let me know if you see her. I'm literally staring straight at her. I'll send you the address now. Shinji's voice was suddenly cut off by the sound of a familiar girl screaming. Kamui, what's going on? You shouted into her phone. The call ended, but a text message quickly popped up soon after. Was Weiss okay? Did something bad happen to her? Did she aggravate her wound? Where are they? Detective Tsukachi's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Yu's eyes scanned her phone as the address appeared on the screen. She's 2 streets away from us, near the intersection on Ren and Zio Street. Take a right here. You said as the car started to speed up, causing her to hold onto the shoulder rest. Got it. Detective Tsukachi as he took a sharp turn, causing Yu to tighten her grip on the shoulder rest as she screamed internally. She wasn't about to embarrass herself in front of this man she had known only for a few days. Yu's mind turned back towards the young white-haired girl she saved. That scream sounded extremely painful. No one deserved to go through something like that, especially at such a young age. Hopefully Shinji could keep her safe until they arrived. By the time they arrived, about a few minutes later, Yu was shocked to see Weiss hugging herself on the sidewalk. Shinji standing off to the side awkwardly as he tried comforting her to no avail. Exciting the car alongside Detective Tsukachi, she motioned several nosy passerbyers to keep on walking. Turning her attention back to the young girl, sniffing on the dirty concrete, MT. Lady gave Kamui Woods a small smile and nodded her head. Taking the hint, he walked over to Tsukachi to clear the area and prevent pictures being taken. I'm not home anymore, aren't I? Weiss mumbled as Yu placed a hand on the blue-eyed girl's shoulder. Yu remained silent as she gently wiped away Weiss' tears and pulled her into a light hug. Feeling her freeze up, Yu pulled away with a sad smile on her face. I'm sorry. Weiss shook her head, her eyes looking at the sky sadly. Let's head back. Dr. Mira wants to give you one last checkup before he discharges you, you said softly. Weiss nodded slowly and grabbed her fallen belongings, helping her to stand up. You mouthed Shinji a thank you as she helped Weiss towards Detective Tsukachi's car. Good job, the detective said once Weiss was seated. The door closed. You sighed in response and waved Shinji goodbye, the wood hero already walking away as he scratched the back of his head. I'm sure she's had a long day. Let's get her some food before heading back. You opened the passenger side door. Detective Tsukachi nodded as he gave Weiss a worried look, the young girl staring outside the window blankly. You just wanted to know one thing at that moment. What triggered such an emotional response in her? Weiss stared out of the car window blankly, her mind still thinking back to the events of the previous night. The moon, that wasn't her moon. Back home you could always see pieces of the shattered moon, even during the time of month when it was supposed to be full. Here, she didn't see the fragments that shone like the stars, only the round fullness of a moon that wasn't her own. She was stuck in a world that wasn't her own. That much was obvious. Now that she had a better view of the outside world, Weiss realized that the streets here looked nothing like the ones in Mistral. Humans, faunas, and others with more extreme quirks, as Detective Tsukachi explained, roamed the sidewalks. This world was weird. They had no grim, no dust, no huntsmen or huntresses, and they didn't have any aura. Instead, this world had quirks, sort of a more extreme semblance. And they had heroes who attended hero schools instead of huntsman academies. Weiss pinched herself. Yup, this was not a dream. After she was returned to the hospital, she underwent one final checkup and was discharged. Dr. Mira was confused why her wound healed so quickly, but dismissed any questions after a brief chat with Detective Tsukachi. The conversation that came afterwards with MT, Lady, and the detective was the most uncomfortable talk Weiss ever had. And that was counting those meetings she had with Father and the board members of the SDC. They asked questions, some of which Weiss answered, and then she would ask her own questions. She didn't like any of the answers she received. Are you hungry? I'm sure you haven't eaten breakfast yet. MT, Lady asked from the front of the car. No longer dressed in her hero costume, she was a pretty woman, most likely around Winter's age, if not a bit younger. She told Weiss to call her you when she was out of her costume. No, thank you for asking. Weiss answered politely. She stayed at the hospital last night since it was too late at night to leave without a place to stay. You had promised to come back to pick her up in the morning, after making sure that Weiss wouldn't try escaping again. Not that the idea crossed her mind. Even if it did, where would she go? Her Leon was useless, she didn't know the city, and Weiss was all alone. If you say so. I'll pick something up since we're already out, and you can eat it whenever you feel like it. You said as she parked on the side of the street. She gave Weiss a small smile. I'll be right back. Weiss didn't respond as you left. She didn't tell them the complete truth about where she was from, only the basics. How she was a huntress in training from Beacon Academy, and how she was 17 years old. That last one earned her a confused look from both adults. The doctors had placed Weiss' age at around 14 to 15 years old, and the official paperwork you signed for Weiss' release said that she was 14 years old. Looking at her reflection in the window, that was understandable. Why did this happen? Was this one of Professor Ozpin's schemes, if it wasn't him? Did that spring maiden do this to her? Magic was able to turn Kuro and Raven into birds. What if it could also deej someone and send them to a completely different world? The lack of sleep caused Weiss' head to hurt, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, silver, lilac, and golden eyes always stared back. Her eyelids slowly started to drop. You left us, Weiss. And I know. Weiss jumped awake, just as you got back into the car. And I'm back. Sorry if I took too long, the line in there was killer. You placed the bags of food on the passenger seat. She turned her head to look at Weiss. Thank you. For what? I didn't do anything. Weiss sighed. She should be the one thanking them. You was the one that saved her life after all. For not driving away with my car. I just bought this baby. You gave her a grin as the car started moving again. Weiss tried glaring at the blonde woman, but she couldn't. Everything was happening too fast. It was like a blur. Hey Weiss, what kind of snakes are found on cars? I don't know. Weiss said absent-minded. Her eyes were busy scanning the strange signs that covered some buildings and staring at passerbyers that had strange appearances. If father didn't like the faunus before, he would have a heart attack once he saw how different people looked here. Some had extra hands, perhaps an extra eyeball. Anything seemed to be possible. Windshield vipers. Yu's blonde hair was suddenly replaced with a familiar gold. Weiss' eyes widened at the sight of Yong and Ruby bickering in the front of the car. Blake seated alongside her with a small smirk. The vision disappeared as soon as it came, leaving Weiss alone in the back seat. Weiss, are you okay? Yu asked, looking at the rearview mirror. Taken out of her thoughts, Weiss touched her cheek, her tears wetting her pale fingers. Was she crying? I'm fine, Weiss said, rubbing the sleeve of her borrowed hoodie that was a few sizes too big on her cheek and eyes, the purple cloth turning damp. Okay, Yu turned her eyes back towards the road. We're going to my agency. You can stay there as long as you want to. Detective Tsukachi said he'll come by later so we can talk in more detail. Too many ears at the hospital, you know? Weiss nodded silently as her hands tightened around the box that held Mirtanaster along with her other belongings, her only connections to her friends. What was she going to do? What could she do? She was just a child now, a child armed tie the teeth, but a child nonetheless. What could a huntress in training do without any grim to fight? KriegSchnee always liked telling stories when Weiss was younger. Many of them were about her own ancestor. The Schnees were one of the ancient houses of Atlas and had a long history. Yet despite hundreds of conflicts or economic crises that came their way, the Schnees survived. And that's what Weiss would do. Survive. Weiss was used to seeing different types of architecture. The Schnee mansion was built using the designs of the old Atlassians given a modern twist. Valish buildings were built with a simple design to maximize the amount of space they had available. And Mistral's designs differed from place to place. But they all had flowing curves in common. When you told Weiss that they were heading to her hero agency building, she didn't know what to expect. The buildings they drove past seemed to be a mixture of Valish and Mistralian cultures, with a dash of other styles that Weiss couldn't recognize. What Weiss did not expect was an average multi-story building with 2 giant horns on the roof. The fact that it was in the middle of the city only made it worse. Is that safe? Weiss asked slowly, holding her box closer as she stood in front of the rather unstable-looking building. Yu walked up to her side, bags of food in hand. Another thing that Weiss didn't notice earlier. Yu was in fact not a faunus despite what she initially thought. The horns were just a part of her costume. Of course it is. The repair company did an excellent job fixing the room after that cavern last month. Yu said casually with a grin. She gave Weiss a wink. Don't worry, I'm the one that caused it anyway, so there's nothing you have to worry about. That just made Weiss worry even more. Come on, let me show you around, and then I'll show you the room where you'll be staying. Yu started walking towards the front door casually. Weiss gave the building one last look over, and swallowed the saliva that had gathered in her mouth. Hopefully the building was up to code. Empty agency, as Yu called the building, was definitely not up to code. More specifically, it wasn't up to Weiss code. Not that the building itself was terrible. The structure seemed solid enough with all of the renovating it must have gone through. Yu was just a really messy person, it seemed. Carefully stepping over a bag of old chips, Weiss' eyes darted all over the living room. Sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting company. And I just went straight to bed after what happened last night, you said, kicking over an empty soda can. Walking over to the kitchen, she placed the bags of food on the table. Feel free to make yourself at home. My casa es tu casa. What did you just say? Casa. Great. Now there's a language that Weiss didn't understand. Or was that some type of slang that this world's version of Mistralian came up with? Thank you. You returned from the kitchen with a bottle of water, which she handed Weiss. Weiss grabbed it with her free hand with a small nod of thanks. So this is the living room. I practically live here since I let the lease on my apartment finish. It's much cheaper than paying for 2 buildings, you said. That's the kitchen over there. I'll have to go grocery shopping later, so the fridge is kinda empty at the moment. She pointed at various objects. That's the TV. Don't turn to channel 6 to 9 after nighttime unless you want to scar your brain. Weiss' face formed a grimace. She knew what porn was, and Blake had several magazines hidden around their room back at Beacon. Young almost died of embarrassment when she caught Ruby about to start reading one. I see, Weiss said dryly. You gave her another smirk before leading her down a hallway. Trash was everywhere, with old wrappers and bottles decorating every free space available. And this is your room. The door to your right down the hall is where I sleep. Downstairs is where I handle hero business, but feel free to explore. I don't have any interns or sidekicks yet, so you have the run of the whole place. You opened the door, revealing a rather modest bedroom. Not that Weiss was complaining. She appreciated what the hero was doing for her. Thank you. Weiss' vocabulary seemed rather limited today. Words couldn't describe how grateful she felt that these strangers were helping. Out of the goodness of their heart, it would seem unless proven otherwise. But help was still help. Decorate it, paint it, do whatever you want with it. The room is yours as long as you want to stay here, you said as Weiss took a small step into her new room. It's perfect. It was more than Weiss should have accepted. She felt bad, having to accept this much charity without being able to do anything in return. She would find a way to repay you as soon as possible. If you get hungry, the food is on the table. You placed a hand on Weiss' shoulder, giving her a reassuring smile. And I'm here if you ever want to talk. Thank you. There were those 2 words again. Weiss forced a smile on her face, the one she used whenever she was performing in front of large crowds. I really appreciate it. You left soon after, leaving Weiss alone in her new room. Placing her box on her new bed, Weiss opened the box slowly. She had a limited supply of dust, so she had to be careful with the amount she used until she could grow more. Her earrings could be used to create more ice dust easily, but the other types would be a bit trickier. Tricky, but not impossible. Weiss was still a Schnee after all, and dust might as well run through her veins. Carefully taking out her torn dress, she placed it on the bed. Once she was settled in and found a way to make some money, she was going to need to buy some new dresses. Weiss didn't want to ask you for money. She wouldn't be that shameless. Next, she grabbed her scroll. Thankfully, she was still able to charge it, but it drew more than a few glances whenever she had it out. It held too many memories to be used in situations it could be destroyed. Weiss would have to keep it in a safe place. Activating the scroll, Weiss' fingers slipped, and she pressed the button that opened her music gallery. It starts with the unexpected loss of someone dear. The recording of Weiss' voice started to sing. This was one of the songs that she never released. She hadn't even showed Ruby and the others. The path to isolation was too personal, too raw to have someone here. The warmth that comforted and cradled just disappeared. Weiss quickly pressed the off button, her shaking hand allowing the scroll to gently fall on the bed. She fought too hard to get back to her friends, suffered those months back in Atlas, hoping she could find a way back to her team. Did that mean her efforts went to waste? Perhaps, but at least Weiss managed to fight alongside them one last time. At least she got to hear Ruby's voice and be able to admire Yang's golden hair. If only she could have seen Blake before all of this happened. Weiss hardened her eyes and grabbed Mirtenaster's hilt. KriegSchnee was a survivor. KriegSchnee was a former student at Beacon. And KriegSchnee was a member of Team rwby, the best first-year team from Beacon. Weiss wouldn't stop fighting. She would find her friends one day. Either in this life or in the one that came after. Weiss would never stop looking for her loved ones. A loud growl interrupted her inner monologue. Blushing softly, she placed Mirtenaster back in the box. Maybe she should take up Yu's offer to eat. Japanese cuisine was pretty similar to Australian food, which was a weird yet reassuring fact to Weiss. Yu had already eaten her food by the time Weiss arrived, but that didn't bother her. Despite being used to having her meals with others, especially due to Ruby's insistence that the team always eat together, the silence was comforting. It allowed Weiss to gather her thoughts, but it was also lonely. Eating a spoonful of the rice and egg mixture that Yu bought, Weiss ate silently as Yu watched some program on the TV, laughing every few seconds. Ruby and Yang would have enjoyed watching that. The food tasted like ash in Weiss' mouth, but she forced herself to keep eating. If she didn't eat, her body would start to suffer. If she started suffering, then she wouldn't be able to keep searching for a way back home. Stuffing the shaking spoon in her mouth, she swallowed now bitter-tasting food. Once she was done, she could go finish unpacking the few belongings she had. Maybe even get started on growing more ice dust from her earrings. Weiss eyed the hallway that led to the elevator. Her plans for the day would have to depend on how long Detective Tsukachi's interrogation lasted. Would it be annoying and be over stuff they already discussed? Most likely, he was a detective. "How's the food?" Yu asked, lifting her head from the couch where she laid. Said couch also covered in old wrappers and bags, much to Weiss' dismay. At least the office downstairs was cleaner. "It's delicious. Thank you for the meal," Weiss said with a slight bow of her head. It wasn't Yu's fault that Weiss' mouth was playing tricks on her. "I'm glad. I've been told that I have great taste." Yu gave Weiss another of her famous winks. "Soon enough I'll have my face on some best-selling cereal box." She formed a dramatic thumbs up, with her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth. "I'll have to work on my pose later." Weiss smiled as she forced another spoonful of rice down her throat. Hopefully the cereal would be good for people, unlike pumpkin peats that John liked to devour during Team rwby and JNPR's breakfast. Pirha would always stare in amazement as the blonde finished half a box in one sitting. Yu went back to watching the TV, laughing as two men started slapping each other comically. Finishing the bowl, Weiss placed it in the sink, which was full of other bowls, plates, and eating utensils. Maybe she could repay Yu in this manner, for now at least. Once she had money, she could repay Yu using that. Tying her loose hair into her signature ponytail, minus the tiara which still sat in her room, Weiss pulled on the pair of unused rubber gloves that sat next to the sink. Did she have any experience when it came to cleaning? Of course not. But if Klein was able to do it, then so could Weiss. "How long has she been at this?" Tsukachi asked slowly, standing in the middle of MT. Ladies' living room, with said hero standing right next to him with wide eyes as they stared at the white-haired girl attempting to clean the kitchen. Attempting was the key word here. "She's been at this for 2 hours now." "MT," lady said hesitantly. "I told her that she didn't have to, but she insisted." The bubbles coming from the sink started to grow in size as Weiss tried scrubbing a dirty plate with the wrong side of a sponge. "I don't think she even noticed you walking in." Tsukachi rubbed his forehead with a sigh. So their interdimensional visitor, who despite being quirkless according to their world standards, possessed a quirk that Tsukachi didn't even think was possible. And to top all of that off, she didn't know how to wash dishes. KriegSchnee was quite the interesting person. Judging by the way she held herself, And by the quality of the dress and sword she was found with, she must have been well off back in her world. Her world, what a strange concept. If his own quirk didn't agree with everything that she said, Tsukachi would have immediately called a psychologist. There was simply no other explanation when combined with her sword and the device she called a scroll. Huntsman academies that seemed so similar to their own schools like UA. Weiss mentally being a 17-year-old, that last one was confirmed by Tsukachi's quirk, much to his shock. Why are you being so difficult? Weiss all but growled as she aggressively scrubbed the same plate over and over again. Her borrowed clothing were now completely soaked in water, with the bubbles from the soap forming weird patterns. Should we say something? Empty. Lady gave Tsukachi a side glance. He shook his head as he carefully moved an old wrapper from the couch. Sitting fiend slowly, his eyes never left Weiss' frustrated form. No, I believe she's just trying to express herself. That would explain why she was trying so hard, and why her eyes were starting to tear up. Weiss released a frustrated scream. Or that was just the soap in her eyes. He had been wrong before. After several embarrassing battles with the various plates and other dirty utensils, Weiss finally decided to give up. Not because she was losing, of course. Weiss never, usually, lost any battles. She decided that it would be better to engage in a strategic withdrawal, because it turned out that Detective Tsukachi had arrived while she was busy. No, it wasn't a single bit embarrassing as she sat at Yu's kitchen table soaking wet, while Detective Tsukachi and Yu finished drying off the rest of the kitchen. Are you sure you don't need help? Weiss winced as Yu finished dumping a bucket of bubbly water back into the sink with the detective's help. The bubbles were almost gone, but there was still a lot of water everywhere. No, Yu's head immediately shot towards her, eyes wide from fear. Weiss flinched softly when the older woman raised her voice. Yu's eyes softened as Weiss' own looked away. You're still recovering from that nasty wound, so just relax. Weiss heard Yu's footsteps draw close, and she was soon pulled into a careful embrace. Thank you. I know that you meant well. Weiss froze, her arms hanging at her side limply. What was she thanking Weiss for? She didn't do anything. Instead, she made a rather big mess. Sniffing softly, Weiss hugged the buxom hero back hesitantly. Don't touch me. Weiss mumbled loudly, wiping her tears on Yu's wet shirt. Yu had a lot of soap still clinging to her shirt, which only made Weiss tear up even more. Yu laughed as she started to pat Weiss' head slowly. Weiss must have been going insane. She only ever allowed the rest of her team to see her like this, and that was quite rare in itself. You're the nicest tsundere I've ever met. Soon what now? Now that that's out of the way, do you mind if I ask you some more questions? I didn't want to ask too many questions at the hospital. Too many eyes and ears, if you know what I mean. Detective Tsukachi didn't pull out a notebook this time, much to Weiss' surprise. The three of them sat at Yu's kitchen table, the kitchen finally dry and clean. This will be off the record, of course. I'm pretty sure my superiors would laugh at me if I told them the truth. That was completely understandable. Weiss was still having trouble coming to terms with it herself. Another world, another life, one that she had to deal with all by herself. Weiss nodded slowly, which earned her a thin smile from the detective. Great. This time he did pull out his worn notebook. First off, I'm still in the process of coming up with an identification card for you, as well as placing you into our system. It'll take a few favors, but I can get it done. No one will be able to tell the difference, even the strictest government officials. Thank you. Why were these people so nice to her? Weiss barely even knew them. They were complete strangers. Yet here they were, trying to help her, even while committing who knows how many crimes in the process. It made Weiss feel dirty inside and useless. Don't worry about it. I just need some information to fill in, so if you ever use your... Detective Tsukachi paused as he looked over his older notes. Semblance in public. We can just pass it off as your quirk. Don't mention her aura to anyone went unsaid, of course. Weiss was sure some people were going to notice the lack of damage she took compared to others without aura. But she could always claim she formed a glyph at the last second. Do you have a name for your semblance? For example, mine's is called gigantification. Yu inserted herself into the conversation. Such a quirk name was self-explanatory and didn't leave much to the imagination. And I call mine's polygraph. Detective Tsukachi added. It doesn't have to be a long or specific name, just something that can quickly explain what you can do. Why were they talking like she was a child? Oh yeah, Weiss scowled internally. She did look like a child, like a little girl that even Whitley could bench press. Aiming her palm upwards, Weiss formed a small white glyph that slowly started to turn. Yu's eyes widened in shock, which made Weiss smirk. She was proud of her semblance, of course. Such a powerful gift was one of the few semblances that could be inherited, and only by those with Schnee blood running through their veins. It made Weiss feel connected to Winter, and even her mother in some form. Whitley never bothered using his gift, calling Weiss childish whenever she practiced the family gift in an attempt to imitate the old Schnee knights of old, riding into battle against the Grimm. What a fool she had been. Heroes like that didn't exist. Not anymore. I call them glyphs. They didn't need to know all of her inner monologue. The glyph's rotation speed started to speed up, before disappearing in a wild blur. Short and to the point. Detective Tsukachi nodded as he wrote in his notebook briefly. That should work, and it doesn't reveal much. His eyes gave you a glance, who gave him a thumbs up, before turning back to Weiss. Would you mind if MT Lady becomes your official guardian? We spoke about this earlier, and she agreed as long as you approve. You smiled, one that Weiss forcefully returned, but she felt numb inside. Everything felt like a dream and was passing by in a blur. Should she say yes? Why would you go through all of that work to help Weiss? Did Weiss even deserve all of this kindness? Especially after everything that her father had done. Japanese culture was also very different from the Four Kingdoms. Would you take it as an insult if Weiss refused? She didn't really have any other place to go. I don't mind. Weiss nodded slowly. She would definitely have to find a better way to repay you. Perhaps she would like a song dedicated to her. This may not be Weiss' original world, or the body she had last week, but her mind was still sharp and her own. Excellent. Now that should be all regarding what I need to come up with your ID. If I need any more information, I'll let you know. Detective Tsukachi closed the notebook. Now, can you please explain these Huntsman Academies? I believe you mentioned that you attended one that was called Beacon. Let's start with that. She was definitely going to keep an eye on what her mouth said now. When you learned that Weiss was from another world, she had assumed it would be similar to one of the animes that she liked to binge whenever she wasn't on patrol. Maybe one of those with super advanced technology where an intelligent student tried to take over the world. She had never been so wrong before. Mankind was forced to gather into Four Kingdoms, with anyone living outside of the kingdoms struggling to survive the hordes of Grimm. Those monsters sounded ferocious, judging the way Weiss described them. Ranging from wolves to giant bees, Grimm came in all shapes and sizes. Humanity's last defense came in the form of the Huntsman Academies, according to Yu's young ward. Huntsmen and huntresses, many who trained from birth, dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent from the Grimm. They were supposed to be humanity's shining beacon of hope, until the light in Weiss' eyes died out when she mentioned the fall of Beacon. Yuz felt her heart start to break as Weiss told her story, with Detective Tsukachi asking a question every once in a while. Weiss' world did seem a bit similar to their own, with Yue and Shiksu High School easily being able to be Beacon's equivalent. So, how good are you at using that fancy sword gun of yours? Yu asked during a lull in the conversation. She needed a small break from all of the information that her brain was trying to process. Weiss' blue eyes seemed annoyed for a second, but that was soon replaced by a haughty look. I would like you to know that I am quite skilled with it. I've trained with Mirtanaster for several years, and it is the perfect weapon when paired with my glyph. Team Ruby was the strongest first-year team back at Beacon. Weiss bragged. And it's spelled rwby if you're still writing things down. She said that last part in English with a pointed look towards the detective. How did a W make a U sound? While you wasn't exactly the brightest person back in school, she definitely knew the English alphabet. Sounds impressive. Detective Tsukachi said. You should try applying to UA High School. They're one of the best hero schools in the area, if not the country. All of the best heroes are alumni from there. You blushed softly. She had to go to an agricultural high school out in the countryside because no city school wanted to accept her due to the damage her quirk could cause. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. Weiss said, all emotion leaving her voice, her shoulders starting to tense. You was sure Weiss could easily pass U.S. entrance exam. But there was a lot of information she would need to learn. Japanese history, for example. Now then, I'm sure that you're all a bit tired from all this talking, so let's take a small break here. You quickly said before the detective could ask another question. Truthfully, she needed the break as much as Weiss did. You was going to need to take some painkillers later for that incoming headache that was starting to form. Detective Tsukachi frowned, but he nodded slightly. Very well. Weiss seemed to relax slightly, but her hands still remained on guard. That works for me, Weiss said. Detective Tsukachi gave her another nod. He was going to have cramps later with how many he's done so far, and left the kitchen table without another word. You eyed the damp clothes that she allowed the young girl to borrow. Shopping was going to be her number one priority once Detective Tsukachi yet. Maybe she could even rope Shinji into carrying their bags for them. Now that sounded like a plan. Stop it. Weiss' harsh voice sliced through Yu's thoughts. Huh? Stop what? The tsundeer's scowl almost made the water Yu was drinking come out through her nose. I know what that look means, Weiss said dryly. Did she have another power that she wasn't telling them? Yu gasped internally. Was Weiss a psychic? And you said all of that out loud. Damn it. Thankfully, the rest of Detective Tsukachi's interrogation passed without much problem. A few half-truths here and there that should be true enough to pass the detective's quirk, but not give away that she was hiding something important, which he most likely already knew. Unless he was an incompetent, as those Veil officers that didn't even try going after Roman Torchwick and the White Fang. But Weiss really doubted that. Detective Tsukachi's quirk would have been wasted on an idiot. Let's go shopping. You tried pulling on Weiss' arm, much to the white-haired girl's annoyance. Did Weiss really need clothes? Judging by the ripped dress in her room and the oversized hoodie and sweatpants she was currently wearing, yes, she did. Did she also want to be further indebted to a woman she already owed a lot to? No. Weiss narrowed her eyes, glaring at the older woman who was trying to drag her into the elevator. Detective Tsukachi already left a while ago, leaving the two women alone. You need clothes. That dress is torn and doesn't even fit you anymore. You can't walk around in these old things. You tried using all of her strength, but Weiss used a glyph to anchor her feet to the ground, with some help from her aura, of course. You did have some good points there, but Weiss didn't want to be a burden on the hero. She already offered Weiss a home, which was more than enough, and was potentially committing crimes with Detective Tsukachi just to get her settled in. Weiss didn't deserve all of this kindness. Seeing Weiss hesitate, Yu gently loosened her grip on Weiss' arm and ran her hand through Weiss' white hair slowly, causing her to flinch softly. If it makes you feel better, we can just get a few necessities and clothes. Nothing fancy, just enough so that you can make yourself feel at home. Yu gave her a reassuring smile. You do need a toothbrush, Unless you want to borrow mine, which is pretty gross, no offense. Ruby accidentally did that the first week at Beacon without Weiss knowing, which made her furious. She remembered dramatically throwing her toothbrush out the window, and made sure to label all of her belongings after that. Weiss shook the memories from her mind. You did make some good points. Biting her bottom lip, Weiss sighed, causing Yu's face to light up. Fine, but nothing too expensive, and only the necessities, Weiss said, causing the glyph beneath her feet to disappear. Yay! Yu beamed as she started dragging Weiss towards the elevator. Hopefully she won't regret this later. Weiss already regretted accepting Yu's offer. Even back home, when Weiss had access to all the wealth that the Schnee family possessed, she hated shopping. Why go shopping when you could have something custom made? All of her dresses were created according to Weiss specifications and taste. For example, the torn blue dress that sat on her bed was created exclusively for her by a famous Atlassian designer who made several versions, including the longer dress she wore at Father's party. Even when she did go shopping, it would usually be such a bore. Just buy the entire store, the back of Weiss' mind would tell her. Naturally, she didn't. Weiss wasn't Whitley, who needed an entire warehouse to hold all of his clothing. But she also wasn't Winter, who once went a whole month wearing the same Atlas Academy just to spite Father, though that wasn't a bad idea. However, there was one thing that Weiss never did whenever she went shopping, even with the rest of Team rwby, and it felt quite weird. I don't need that many clothes, Weiss grumbled as she struggled to hold a dozen bags in her hand. It was such an annoying feeling, even with her aura protecting her fingers. Was this how Ruby felt when Weiss made her carry all of those bags during one of their many visits to Vale? Don't worry about it. I'll just write them off on my taxes. Yu ignored Weiss as they walked through a mall. The overall layout was similar to the ones Weiss had been to before, with a food court in the center selling overpriced food. Japanese clothing styles were completely different from what Weiss was used to, though she could spot some similarities to Mistralian and Valish fashion. Weiss only wanted to buy a pair of pants and a shirt, along with any toiletries that she needed. Yu ended up dragging her into multiple stores, walking out with several dresses that, while were Weiss style, were most likely of dubious quality. Any attempts at escaping failed since she didn't know the area, and thus Weiss had to deal with such torture. They paused in front of a lingerie store, which caused Weiss to blush softly. She was definitely not going to go in there with this woman. Yu gave Weiss a side glance and walked past the store. We already grabbed a few sports bras and other underwear. I'm sure nothing in there will fit you anyway, Yu said with a teasing grin on her face. Hey, Weiss' pale face must have been as red as a tomato. While Weiss may not have been as developed on Young, Winter, or Blake, she was completely flat. Weiss was perfect just the way she was, and she was built to be a fencer. At least I don't have to deal with back problems. Yu paused suddenly as she started coughing violently, her own face starting to blush. A few passerbyers gave her a weird look, and quickly took the long way around them, as if Yu was infected with a contagious disease. Shut up. Yu walked away stiffly, which caused Weiss to smirk. At least she won this round. We have a few more stores to go to. Oh no. Are you hungry? Yu asked as Weiss basically collapsed onto her seat. After a couple more stores, Weiss finally managed to convince Yu that they should take a break from shopping, much to the older woman's disappointment. Weiss was just relieved that she was finally able to rest her poor fingers, allowing her aura to heal the dull ache. Weiss' mouth was halfway open when her stomach decided to answer for her with a small grumble. Blushing softly, Weiss shook her head. You already spent enough money for today. She was just growing a debt that couldn't easily be repaid at the moment. I'll take that as a yes, Yu said, getting up from the table they had claimed. She glanced around the crowded food court, eyeing the various food stands. You stay here while I go find something for us to eat. You're not a picky eater, right? B-boot? No buts, you exclaimed, gaining the attention of a small family that sat at the table next to them. Their baby started crying after you startled her, causing the parents to shoot them dirty glares. You ignored them, focusing her gaze on Weiss. I'll be right back. Don't talk to strangers, and don't let anyone take my seat. She pointed at the two empty chairs in front of Weiss, more particularly the one she just got out of. Fine. Weiss sighed, making sure to send her hardest glare towards the light blonde woman. Crossing her arms, Weiss was left all alone in the middle of the crowded food court. Happy families, loving couples, and groups of friends all ate together. Her eyes lingered too long on a group of 4 girls, who started laughing when one of them dropped her ice cream cone. Seeing a flash of red, white, black, and yellow, she turned her eyes away abruptly. Feeling her left hand start to shake, she steadied it with her right. It was hard to believe that just days ago, Weiss had just reunited with her friends, seeing them for the first time in months. Just yesterday, she was escaping the hospital she had woken up in. Now here she was, sitting in a mall waiting for a person who might as well be a stranger to bring back food, and accepting the clothes that you had bought for her. Weiss was pathetic. How could you leave us, Weiss? You returned with pizza, which was a meal that Weiss was familiar with at least. Sensing Weiss' discomfort, they finally went home after eating. Grabbing the bags from the car trunk, they felt even heavier in Weiss' hands now than earlier. Was it exhaustion? Or maybe was it some form of guilt from accepting so much charity? The only thing that Weiss felt was the knot that formed in her stomach. What an annoyance that feeling was. She didn't like it. Thank you, Weiss said as she walked into MT agency alongside you. She owed her so much, for the lodging, the food, the clothes, just everything. You didn't have to go this far, but she went the extra mile anyways. Weiss was starting to see why she called herself a hero, which was still a bit presumptuous in Weiss' opinion. People didn't have the right to call themselves heroes. That was a title that should be earned, not given. You had earned it. Don't worry about it, you said casually. Fitting into the elevator was a bit hard considering the amount of bags they had. But they managed. I'm serious. Weiss turned her face hard, suppressing her emotions from showing themselves. Words can't describe how thankful I am. You literally have only known me for a few days, and I was asleep for most of them. The elevator door opened just as Weiss' voice was starting to crack. Neither of them moved despite the open door. For all you could have known, I could have been a kid running from home, but you still saved me anyways. Even after saving me, you're still helping me, spending all that money. Weiss' cheeks felt wet. You didn't have to do all of that. Yu's eyes looked blurry from Weiss' point of view, but she didn't care. Why are you helping me so much? You placed her free arm around Weiss' shoulder and pulled her into a half hug, much to her chagrin. You're right, you said softly. But I wanted to do all of that. I wasn't about to leave you alone and throw you out of the street. Weiss felt Yu's hand run itself through her hair, causing her shoulders to tense. I'm not doing this out of guilt or hoping that you'll repay the favor one day. Yu whispered. I'm doing this because I want to. The elevator doors closed silently. Sniffing softly, Weiss berated herself internally. Why was she showing her emotions so openly? Why was she acting like this? Was it the stress of everything finally crashing down on her? She didn't know, and it didn't matter. Thank you. Yu was a hero. She was Weiss' hero. Thank you. Yang would never let her hear the end of this if she ever found out. After that particularly embarrassing moment in the elevator, Weiss found herself organizing the clothes Yu had bought for her. The room had a small closet, along with a dusty, old drawer that should serve its purpose well. Organizing her new clothes by style and functionality, Weiss couldn't stop herself from feeling guilty, despite what Yu said earlier. What kind of person was she? If Weiss was in Yu's position, would she do the same? Or was she too stuck up and guarded, like the Ice Queen nickname that had been given to her back at Beacon? Weiss knew all of the rumors that the other teams whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. Daddy Schnee bought her way into Beacon. Anyone who lost to her in Professor Goodwich's class took a bribe. Professor Port weakened that one Borbatusk before class even started, presenting Weiss Schnee, the Ice Queen of Beacon Academy. To be fair, she did kind of deserve it with the way her attitude had been, but Weiss was more than her family's money. That's why she chose going to Beacon Academy instead of Atlas. General Ironwood was a close family friend, and while she was sure he wouldn't provide special treatment, that wouldn't have stopped the other instructors and students from trying to gain her favor. Folding a pair of light blue jeans, Weiss hardened her eyes. At least she had the rest of Team rwby to rely on, even Team JNPR to a certain extent. Was it obvious that she didn't have that many friends? Still, more thoughts kept plaguing the back of her mind. Did they win? Did they lose the Battle of Haven? Did her friends care that she wasn't there? What if they were looking for her? Weiss deflated as she allowed herself to lean against the bed. Did they think she was dead? Yet for every question that Weiss had, she wouldn't gain an answer for any of them. Looking out the window, this world's moon slowly started to rise in the sky. A knock at the door tore Weiss away from her thoughts. "It's open," Weiss said softly, gathering most of the now empty bags. Throwing them away seemed like a waste, so she would have to find a way to reuse them. Yu poked her head through the door's opening. "Mind if I come in?" She was still wearing her casual clothes from earlier, but her hair was tied into a ponytail instead of being free. "As a matter of fact, I do," Weiss said dryly. Yu pouted, which made Weiss form a smirk. "Come in." Yu grinned as she pushed the door open with one hand, keeping the other behind her back. "I hope you like the room. I know it's not much, but it's home, for me at least, and I hope that one day it can be yours too. It's more than enough." Weiss took a seat on the edge of her new bed. "And we're not having the same conversation again." She said that last part with a hard glare. Yu only laughed heartily. "If you say so. Anyways, I have something else for you." She sat next to Weiss, revealing a small box that she had been hiding behind her back. "You know that I can't accept that," Weiss started, only to be rudely interrupted. "This is from Detective Tsukachi. He gave it to me earlier since you were busy with the dishes," Yu said teasingly, causing Weiss to flush at the recent memory. "Go on, open it." "Fine." Grabbing the box, Weiss opened it slowly, revealing one of this world's scrolls, a phone if Weiss remembered right. Staring in shock, Weiss gently picked up the device, its color a bright white with red accents. It looked new and expensive. How much?" He said to not worry about it. Yu said, leaning back on the bed. "His number and mine are already saved on it. I'm sure you'll want to take good care of that scroll thingy from your world. And it kinda draws too much attention, no offense." "Thank you." Weiss was getting very tired of those two words. She would need to work on her vocabulary once she had the chance. "I'll be sure to pass that along." Yu sat up dramatically. She took a look at her own phone. "I'll let you get some shut-eye. It's starting to get late." She started walking towards the door, but paused as soon as she touched the doorknob. "I hope you have a good night's sleep. I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." The pit in Weiss' stomach returned. "Good night." Yu gave Weiss a smile and closed the door behind her. Taking another look at her new phone, Weiss placed it on top of the drawer gently. She could finish setting it up tomorrow. It was late after all, and she did have a long day. Maybe some sleep could do her some good. Changing into a new nightgown, a white one that fell toward her knees, Weiss climbed into her bed after turning off the lights. Hopefully she'll feel better in the morning. "You're such a disappointed Weiss." Weiss shot up with a gasp. a light layer of sweat covering her pale skin. Taking deep breaths, she flinched when she felt someone touch her shoulder. Weiss, is everything okay? A very familiar voice said. Turning her head slightly, beautiful silver eyes met Weiss' blue. Ruby! Weiss threw her arms around the scythe wielder, tears already falling down her cheek. The dark-haired girl hugged back confused. Was it all just a dream? A nightmare? Who are you, and what have you done to Weiss? A teasing voice said. Pulling away from Ruby, Weiss' eyes widened. Amber, lilac, and silver eyes all stared at her. She was back. Weiss was back home. She was. Wait, she knew this place. She spent most of a year here, studying and training to become a huntress. Standing up slowly with shaky legs, all of the air in Weiss' lungs disappeared. Why was she at Beacon? Weiss felt her body go numb. She was back in her old room at Beacon. What was going on here? Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sight of the haphazard bunk beds they had built their first week here. Is everything okay? Weiss screamed? Young said with a smirk. Weiss' eyes frantically met hers. Dressed in an orange tank top with shorts, Young still had her right arm. Cat got your tongue? I take offense to that. Blake added dryly, her amber eyes alternating between the book in her hands and Weiss' sweat-covered form. Yang, leave Weiss alone. Can't you see that she had a bad dream? Ruby pouted as she eagerly wrapped her arms around Weiss. She's finally showing us love. Ruby buried her head in the crook of Weiss' neck, and where she normally pushed off the younger girl, this time Weiss relished the touch, with her own arms wrapped around her partner numbly. What happened? Yang, your arm. Vital Festival. Haven Weiss started blurting out, none of the words forming a coherent statement. Did you hit your head or something? Team JNPR won the Vital Festival, remember? Yang raised an eyebrow. John won't stop talking about how Team JNPR is the best first-year team. Pirha just got luck in that last round with that last strike. Pirha's alive, Weiss croaked as Ruby snuggled closer. The three other girls gave Weiss confused looks. Of course she is. She's not called the Invincible Girl for nothing, you know. Blake said, placing the book in her lap. That wasn't possible. Pirha had died during the Battle of Beacon, her body turned into nothing more than ashes. Weiss had even seen the grand funeral the Nico's family held in her honor. Weiss, are you okay? Blake's eyes seemed worried now. Why was everyone asking her that? Weiss was perfectly fine, extremely confused, but fine. Ruby placed a hand on Weiss' forehead, her silver eyes widening slightly. Oh no, she's burning up. Should we take her to the infirmary? I'm fine, you dolt, Weiss blurted out. There was something wrong here, but it felt so right. Prying herself from Ruby's embrace, Weiss already missed the younger girl's touch. And she's back. There's our Ice Queen, Young winked. Weiss felt her heart tighten slowly as she felt her legs start to shake. She wanted to hold each of the three girls close and never let them go. But there was something off about this place. Yang had her arm. Beacon was still standing. Team JNPR won the Vital Festival, and Pirha was still alive. Team JNPR's room was literally across the hallway. Jumping up, Weiss stomped towards the door when she felt Ruby hug her from behind. Don't leave us, Weiss. She felt a damp spot on her back, her own eyes still tearing up. Weiss paused as her hands touched the cool metal of the doorknob. Stay here, with us. You're nothing more than a disappointment. Staring at the doorknob, Weiss hardened her heart. Teethay didn't need her. Opening the door, Weiss stepped out into the hallway, leaving a distraught Ruby behind. The sound of her crying broke Weiss' heart, but it needed to be done. None of this was real, and Team RWBY could survive without their W. They would be stronger without her. Weiss, come back, Ruby said, staring at Weiss from the door. Feeling her resolve starting to crack, Weiss knocked on Team JNPR's door. There was no answer, but the door creaked open with a small groan. Pirha, John? Weiss took a hesitant step forward, pushing the rest of the door open. The lights were off, and Weiss didn't have Blake's superior vision to see in the dark. Ren? Nora? She flicked the light switch, and she screamed. Laying right in the middle of Team JNPR's dorm room was Pirha, with a large spear protruding from in between her breast. Her green eyes, once full of life, seemed dull. The pool of blood that she laid in only seemed to grow larger, causing Weiss to take a few steps back, almost stumbling in the process. Taking several unsteady breaths, Weiss felt something pierce her skin from behind. Falling to her knees, her eyes turned to the golden spear that struck Weiss in her side, her aura doing nothing to stop the pain or bleeding. She felt someone roughly grab her chin, forcing her head to the side. Light blue eyes met Weiss, with the spring maiden's face giving her a wicked smile. Weiss couldn't feel her body anymore as the pain in her side only grew. "You're nothing without your name." With that, Weiss screamed, and she woke up. Weiss sat up quickly with a gasp. Reaching toward her side, her hands found nothing but her own healing skin. She was back in her room at MT Agency, the darkness covering her room. WSS, it all just a dream. It felt so real. She pulled her knees close to her chest and wrapped her arms around herself. A sob tore through the silence of the room as Weiss cried. She missed them all so much. DHR missed how Blake would get all annoyed whenever Young would mix some of Weiss' coffee in her tea. She missed Young's lame attempts at comedy. But most of all, she missed Ruby. The stupid klutz who never knew when to quit, who always held onto Weiss' arm whenever they watched a scary movie. Weiss missed all of that. She struggled to control her breathing in between sobs. Eventually, she ran out of tears to cry. Taking a deep breath, Weiss licked her lips. Whenever she was feeling emotions as strong as this, she poured out her emotions into song. She did that the night Winter left for the military, and whenever father and mother would start screaming at each other. Lights glimmer in a flower, like jewels in a dream, Weiss started to sing, her voice hoarse. Whatever words that appeared in her head or heart easily escaped her lips. The sky breathes life, love to everything. Weiss' voice cracked. Only the moonlight pierced the darkness of her room. At times, I've thought, I'm not enough. The chains that tied my heart. But there's a path that lies ahead for you and I. Weiss' mind drifted to you, who was most likely sleeping peacefully down the hall. Could Weiss ever come to trust and love her like she did her team? Memories fade away, clouds of yesterday. Weiss wiped the leftover tears that stained her face. Would she remember their voices months from now? How Ruby's voice would crack whenever she got too excited. With no one to love, is this life worth living? Did she even deserve to live with all the lives her family had ruined? Come back to me, and stay by my side. Weiss' voice grew louder as she closed her eyes shut. I feel my heart shake. Come ease this ache. Young's eyes widened in surprise when Weiss presented her a new pair of boots, pulling the heiress into a hug. I'm standing over here, reaching for you a million miles away. Come back and stay. Weiss held herself even tighter as memories flooded her mind. Blake smiled when Weiss presented her a brand new set of teacup. No matter how far the memories may be. Winter pulled Weiss into a tight embrace. When I close my eyes, you're all that I see. Ruby gave Weiss a smile as they held hands walking through the rented house in Mistral, the day before that fateful battle at Haven. Come back to me. Weiss held the notes as best as she could with the condition her throat was in. A million miles away. She felt her eyes slowly start to drop. See, come back and stay. Exhaustion took her. You sat outside of Weiss' door as she struggled to hold in her tears. She was failing miserably. She had heard Weiss crying in her sleep and was about to enter the younger girl's room when she started to sing. You knew none of the words Weiss was singing since she was singing in a language other than Japanese, German if she had to guess. But she could easily understand the meaning. Music could cross borders, no matter the language it was in. You was a big fan of those Korean bands that were all rage now. Weiss' voice was pretty, and it was obvious to even use untrained ears that she was experienced when it came to singing, which was a big surprise to you. It also hammered home the fact that you truly did not know Weiss. Like they said earlier in the elevator, they had only known each other for less than a week. You leaned her head against the door softly. Weiss seemed to have fallen asleep, judging by how abruptly her singing stopped. Good, she needed the rest after the long day she had. Rubbing her eyes slowly, you stood up without a sound, hoping to not wake Weiss. It must have been so horrifying, learning that she was now stuck in a world that wasn't hers. Hearing Weiss sob as she sang her sad yet beautiful song made Yu's heart ache. What could she do to help her? Empty. Lady was a new hero, a rising star on the scene that wasn't afraid to fight the nastiest of criminals. But this was scarier than fighting any villain. Yu was an only child, and she didn't have any experience raising children. Weiss was still a child, despite how old she claimed to be mentally. She placed a hand on the door and pressed her forehead against the wood. Yu truly meant what she had told Weiss in the elevator, and she would continue to help Weiss, even if she said she didn't need any. Yu wouldn't push Weiss to open up, but she could provide for her physically and be there for her emotionally whenever she was ready. The cute tsundere was already opening up a little, but she was still on guard. Her hands kept drifting to her waist where she would hold her sword, even if it wasn't on her. Sleep well, Yu said, her voice not even more than a whisper. She would be by Weiss' side, watching over her, caring for her, and maybe one day, Weiss would open up to her. And perhaps, maybe, just maybe, Weiss could learn to call this place home. Weiss woke up feeling exhausted, and her throat felt a bit sore. Maybe singing her heart out while sobbing wasn't exactly the smartest thing to do, but she did feel a little better. Music was how she expressed her feelings, releasing everything that she kept bottled up. She often got in trouble with the rest of Team rwby, but as much as Weiss loved them, she wasn't going to change that part of her life for them. Music was how she coped with her issues, and it worked for her so far. Stretching her arms, Weiss slowly slid off of the bed. Should she get dressed and then handle her hygiene? Weiss glanced at the nightgown she was wearing, its soft fabric rubbing against her skin. You had already seen her wearing this, and unless Detective Tsukachi showed up, you hadn't mentioned the chance of them having any visitors. She should be fine for now, but she would take a change of clothes just in case. Grabbing the bag filled with her products, Weiss left her room and headed towards the bathroom. Thankfully, you didn't seem to be awake yet, which was fine. Weiss was an early riser, a habit that she found made the most efficient use of her time. Ruby had tried to dull her edge, but this blade was still as sharp as ever. Quietly entering the bathroom, Weiss placed the bag on the sink's counter. The mirror allowed her to finally get a good look at herself. She looked like a mess, with dark bags under her eyes. Her light blue eyes were bloodshot, and her long white hair that fell to her hips were tangled and oily. At least Yu's shower looked clean. After that refreshing shower, Weiss walked out of Yu's bathroom with a towel wrapped around her head and dressed in some casual clothes that Yu forcibly bought for her. The jogging pants were comfortable, but the t-shirt felt a bit itchy, which was a bit annoying. "You?" Weiss said out loud. The only response she received was silence, the only noise being the hum of the air conditioner. Was it too early? Or did Weiss accidentally sleep in? The sun still seemed like it was still rising when she glanced outside the window earlier. Making a quick stop in her room to grab her new phone, and staring at Mirtanaster longingly, Weiss set out to find her new guardian. Stepping out of the hallway and into the living room, her search immediately ended. Laying on the couch with her arms and legs spread wide open, was Yu snoring loudly, drool forming a waterfall in the corner of her mouth. A blanket had fallen on the ground next to the couch. The next thing that caught Weiss' eye was trash, more specifically, the lack of trash. Several large garbage bags sat in a corner, with the once filthy room now being spotless. Was this what she was doing all night? Smiling softly, Weiss pulled the blanket over Yu's sleeping form. She could ask for her help setting up the phone later. Weiss' eyes were suddenly drawn towards the kitchen. Time to make breakfast. Yu groaned softly as she rolled on her side, smearing her drool all over her cheek. After hearing Weiss' solo concert in the middle of the night, Yu decided that MT agency was a bit of a mess, and it definitely wasn't a place where she could raise a child with all of the trash laying around. Health hazards or something like that. Yu wasn't paying attention the last time Shinji gave her a rant about making sure to clean her living space. Was he still mad she stole the spotlight when they captured that giant villain? Probably. But that didn't stop her from sleeping peacefully at night. Well, not last night, but her point still remained. Yu snuggled against the pillow she wrapped herself around, strands of her blonde hair sticking to her lip. With her sore muscles relaxing, Yu hummed nonsensically. She smelled something weird, causing her nose to scrunch up. She didn't pass gas, did she? Yu took another sniff. Nope, that wasn't gas, and she would have felt it. That smell was a bit familiar, though. It smelled a bit like charcoal, as if something or someone was burning. Cracking an eye open slowly, Yu was immediately blinded by the light. Sitting up slowly with a groan, the smell was starting to overwhelm her senses. What did it smell like? It was right on the tip of Yu's tongue. Stretching her arms with a loud yawn, smoke entered her lungs, causing her to cough violently. Oh yeah, it smelled like something was burning. Wait, something was burning. Yu jumped up from the couch and tripped over the couch as she tried running towards the kitchen, where the smoke was coming from. Weiss, where are you? Yu shouted, only to be greeted to quite a surprising sight. Standing in front of the sink with a burnt pan and a flaming wooden spatula was Weiss, with a grimace on her face. What happened here? Meeting Yu's eyes with an embarrassed blush all over her face, Weiss rubbed her left arm with her right. How does cereal for breakfast sound? Weiss said, looking away, her eyes now refusing to meet Yu's. Flashing the beautiful young girl a smile, Yu nodded. That sounds delightful. Yu walked towards the nearest window and opened it. Hopefully the smell would be gone in an hour or so. She had to go out on patrol in a little bit. But she could cancel that if Weiss wasn't comfortable being alone. At least MT agency was still in one piece. Sadly, Yu spoke too soon as the cast iron pan lit up on fire somehow. How did she? Weiss ate her cereal numbly. Maybe there was a reason why Ruby said she was banned from their kitchenette back at Beacon. At first, she simply thought that the younger girl was jealous of her cooking skills despite having climbed to do all of her actual cooking. She had never been so wrong before in her life. So, do you have any plans today? Yu said as she sat across from Weiss, eating from her own bowl of cereal. It was a far cry from the fancier breakfast Yu had bought them yesterday, which Weiss had attempted to imitate with the few ingredients Yu had in her fridge and pantry. Not really. Could you help me set up my phone later? Weiss said politely as she cleaned her lips with a napkin, preventing a milk mustache from being worn. It's different from my scroll, so I could really use your help. Once that was done, she could start finding a way to repay you for all of the expenses. Can birds fly? Yu answered as she slurped the remaining milk from her bowl, causing pieces of the cereal to stick to the side of her lips. Grabbing a napkin, Weiss leaned over the table and gently touched Yu's chin with her right hand, and cleaned her face with a napkin she held in her left. Her hand froze once Yu's face was clean. Silver eyes seemed to smile after Weiss wiped Ruby's cheek, after the silver-haired girl smeared ice cream all over it. They pressed their foreheads together with Weiss returning the smile. Weiss, are you okay? Weiss felt someone touch her shaking hand. Shaking the memory out of her hair, Weiss noticed the position she was in and scrambled back into her seat. I'm sorry. Weiss squeezed her thigh in an attempt to stop her hand from shaking. Shutting her eyes closed, she didn't notice you get up from her seat until she felt the other woman's arms around her. I'm here for you, Weiss. I'll be here as long as you need me. You murmured as Weiss slowly returned her embrace. Why was she like this? Why was she so weak? Wee did this happen to her? Weiss remained silent as her body continued to shake, taking in unsteady breaths. She didn't know how long you held her, but there was little the hero could do to comfort her. Once she was sure she wasn't going to burst out crying, Weiss released you from her hold, forcing herself to smile softly as you ran her hand through Weiss' hand. She placed a hand on top of Izuku, whose worried face only made Weiss feel even more guilty. Let's go set up my phone. She was going to have to sing more once she was alone. Come back to me. The phone was easier to set up than Weiss realized it would be. That only made her feel like she wasted Yu's time. But the blonde woman waved off any attempts at apologizing. Staring at the contacts saved in her new phone, Weiss sighed as she stared at the only 2 numbers she had saved. She placed the phone to the side as she laid on the bed. Her loose hair sprayed all over the sheets. You had left Weiss' room a few minutes earlier. That was perfectly fine with Weiss. She needed some alone time to brainstorm ideas to make money to repay you. Hopefully Detective Tsukachi would return soon with some forms of identification to make doing so easier. Weiss eyed the new phone. You had explained how to use the internet, as well as gave several warnings on strangers and weird links that gave viruses. Perhaps she should start researching this country's customs first. During the years father spent training her as heiress to the SDC, Weiss learned that the various kingdoms and even cities had different ways of doing things. This world would be no different. She might as well make the best of this silence. Plus, it beats Yu's idea of exploring the neighborhood. No, Weiss didn't need to do such a thing. Not until she knew more about this world and its strange quirks. Japanese culture was a far cry from Australian culture. The only similarities they had were the language, and some aspects when it came to food. For example, the way their names worked was completely foreign in Weiss' mind. For example, Yu's name back on Remnant, or these Western countries on the other side of the planet, would be Yu Takeyama. Here in Japan, she would be Takeyama Yu, with most people calling her by her last name, unless they were close. The whole culture was built around a mutual respect that interested Weiss. Her mind immediately turned to Yu as her eyes scanned the internet page she was reading. She told Weiss to call her Yu, which now made her heart warm. Did that mean Yu trusted Weiss? Did she see the displaced girl as a friend? Weiss couldn't stop herself from smiling, but that also made the pit in her stomach grow. What would she do if there was a way back home? Weiss had only known Yu for a few days, but it felt like she had known her for years. She shook the thoughts out of her head. There was no way back home, and Weiss would be stuck here forever. She took in a sharp intake of air as she kept studying. Red like roses fill my dream and brings me to the place you rest. Weiss sang softly in Atlassian. She wrote this song. It was more of a poem, really. Shortly after the fight with the White Fang and Roman Torchwick at the docks. The rest of the team had been happy, and even helped with the lyrics. White as cold and always yearning, burdened by a royal test. Weiss' eyes hungrily took in all of the information. Black the beast descends from shadows. Blake was the one who wrote that line, despite Weiss, Young, and Ruby's protest. Weiss would have to rewrite that later. Yellow beauty burns gold. A knock came from the door. Weiss quickly turned off the phone as Yu stuck her head through the door. She seemed to be wearing her hero costume now, the horned domino mask covering her face. Hiya. Not watching porn already, are you? No. Weiss' face flushed. Yu laughed loudly, her eyes shining brightly. I need to go out on patrol for a bit. Gotta those bills, you know. You said with a wink. Her face suddenly turned serious. Are you going to be okay alone? I'll be gone an hour or two at most. I'll be fine, Weiss replied. She wasn't a child. Well, technically she was. But that didn't apply to her. Once she was done here, she could go and practice her forms with Mirtenaster on the third floor that you kept empty. Winter would be disappointed in her if she found out that she grew lazy, and the wound in her side was almost gone as well, her aura taking care of it. You nodded. I'll see you soon then. You have my number if anything happens, and I'll be bringing dinner, so don't worry. She paused and looked down the hallway before sticking her head back in the room. And there'll be some money on the counter to buy snacks if you get hungry. Don't cook anything went unsaid. But Weiss understood the meaning well enough. Thank you. You smiled, and was about to close the door when she stopped at the last second. This time, she poked the upper half of her body through the door. Oh, and Weiss, you have a really pretty voice. This time she did leave, closing the door shut. Weiss' eyes widened slightly as she felt her lips separate. Did you hear her last night? Or did she manage to hear parts of what she was singing? She hoped it was the latter and not the former. Turning the phone's screen back on, her eyes were drawn to her scroll, which sat on the bed next to her. Wait a minute. She was a famous singer back on Remnant, with every single one of her concerts selling out, and most of her songs instantly went #1. Weiss grabbed the scroll and went to her files. All of the original files for her songs were here, as well as all of the sheet music. With a large grin attaching itself to her lips, Weiss started to giggle, which turned into full-on laughter. Her new phone started to buzz. She hit the green answer button on the screen after seeing Yu's name pop up. Yes? Thank goodness you're okay, Yu shouted, causing Weiss to flinch. Why? Weiss held the phone away from her ear, but close enough that she could hear. I heard you laughing. I was afraid that this would be your villain origin story. Weiss immediately ended the call. Leaning against the bed's headrest, she sighed, but her smile never left her face. She finally found a way to repay you. Running an aura-protected finger along Mirtenaster's blade, Weiss inspected her beloved sword for any imperfections. There weren't any, of course. Mirtenaster was designed by Weiss, and she helped in its creation physically. Mirtenaster was an extension of her very being, an extension of her very soul. Without Mirtenaster, Weiss would be incomplete. Her body was trained to be able to use it to its fullest potential, using the ice skating and ballet skills she perfected when she was younger. In Weiss' hands, Mirtenaster was the perfect weapon. Holding the sword in her left hand, Weiss struck a pose, with her right hand hovering where the dust chamber met the blade. Sadly, Mirtenaster was dependent on her supply of dust, which would be severely limited in this world. Growing more with the old Schnee techniques would take a while, but it was possible. She already emptied the dust vials in the chamber, hiding them in a box under her bed. Forming a glyph beneath her feet, Weiss launched herself forward, Mirtenaster ready to strike her imaginary opponent. Thrusting her sword forward, Weiss used another glyph to change her direction, avoiding the wall. MT Agency was a 4-story building, with the first floor looking like a normal office workspace, albeit with posters of Yu posing suggestively in her costume. The second floor held their living quarters as well as other rooms. The third and fourth floors were empty, void of any furniture with plenty of space to practice. Jumping, Weiss landed on a glyph that formed on a wall and used it to send herself gliding through the air, before striking another pose in the middle of the empty space. Aiming the blade downwards, Weiss formed another glyph, a different one with a unique pattern. The armored head of the Arma Gigas appeared, the very grim that gave Weiss her distinct scar. Could she have had it healed? She had access to the finest doctors and surgeons after all, but doing so would be folly. The scar helped Weiss to remember that she wasn't invincible. that she could be defeated in combat. Winter had thrown a fit when she found out that Weiss refused to use her aura to heal the wound. Perhaps she had done it out of spite since everyone in her life abandoned her. Winter ran away to the army, leaving Weiss to be molded by father's lessons on running the family business. Mother didn't even seem to notice, so engulfed in her own world, and Whitley only gave her a snide comment. At least the tabloids ate it up, with some accusing the infamous KriegSchnee of child abuse. The rumors quickly disappeared, the tabloid companies being bought out not long after. Staring at the armored knight, Weiss waved the glyph away along with the Armagigas. Nobody needed to know what she was truly capable of. Keeping a few cards hidden would be beneficial in the future. She started working on her slashes, thrusts, and ripostes, twirling and dancing as she fought the air. Forming another glyph, Weiss used it to catch her to take a small break. Taking several deep breaths, she allowed her aura to soothe her almost healed wound. Weiss had been working out for nearly 2 hours now, using as little aura as possible in the beginning. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, using her sleeve, Weiss started to do her final stretches, her mind drifting back to her scroll. She had albums worth of music stored, ranging from all types of genres that she experimented with. Hopefully she could find a record company that would take her in. That was pretty impressive. You should consider applying to UA. Weiss quickly turned around, Mirtenaster in hand, and stopped her slash an inch away from the intruder's neck. Purple eyes met Weiss' light blue. I'm so sorry. Weiss removed Mirtenaster from nearly taking Yu's neck off, and bowed her head while shutting her eyes closed. Don't worry about it. You're far from the scariest villain I've had to face. Yu patted the smaller girl's back softly. That did little to comfort Weiss. The people here didn't have aura, and while some were durable, Yu could have been injured, and it would have been Weiss' fault. She would have to adjust how much strength she used in the future. When did you get back? Weiss said, changing the conversation. Not too long ago. I tried calling you down for dinner, but someone wasn't answering their phone. Yu smirked. She smiled as if Weiss hadn't almost taken her head off just moments earlier. So I guessed that you were up here. She didn't deserve her. Oh, Weiss had muted her phone beforehand, not wanting anything to interrupt her concentration. I'm sorry. You pup. Yu placed a finger on Weiss' lips, silencing her. Stop apologizing for everything. Now let's go eat. We have guests, so be on your best behavior. Guests? Yu sniffed the air, and her smile turned into a grimace. Take a shower first, though. You stink. I hate you. Weiss grumbled as they both made their way to the elevator. Mirtenaster aimed towards the ground. Yu only pulled Weiss close as soon as the elevator doors closed, gagging as she did so. I know you mean love. After taking a quick shower that did confirm Yu was over-exaggerating, Weiss exited the bathroom in a fresh pair of clothes. Mirtenaster was back in her room, locked away in her closet. Drying her hair with a towel wrapped around her neck, Weiss made a quick stop in the laundry room, dropping off said towel, and made her way to the living room. Nice of you to finally make it. I was about to send a search party. Yu said from the table, a man Weiss had never seen seated across from her. The man's skin was tanned, and he wore a tight blue costume with wood attached. Weiss blinked slowly. Correction, the man seemed to be made of wood, most likely his quirk. He seemed a bit familiar. Weiss, meet Shinji Nishia. Shinji, meet Weiss. A pleasure to meet you, Nishia. Weiss gave a slight bow of her head. She took the seat next to Yu. Same here. I'm glad to see that you're feeling better, Nishia said. And don't worry about the naming thing. I'm sure it'll take some getting used to. Feel free to call me Shinji, unlike someone else here. He glared at Yu, who grinned sheepishly. What did he mean by that? I filled him in already. Weiss' head turned so fast. Her hair slapped the other side of her head. What? Don't worry, Shinji is the one that found you the night you escaped the hospital, you said as she opened her bowl of food. Now let's eat before this food gets even colder. Soggy noodles are the worst. Weiss' eyes darted between the two heroes. Did these two have something going on? The two started bickering as soon as Weiss started eating her own meal. At least dinner came with a show. During the next few days, Weiss found herself falling into a pattern. She would wake up early in the morning and eat breakfast with you once the blonde hero decided to wake up. After that, you would head out on patrol for a bit, which gave Weiss a chance to start growing her dust. She found a storage room on the 4th floor that was out of the way, and it had a lock on the door. It was perfect. Ice, fire, and rock dust were the easiest ones to grow. She placed the rock dust in a pot full of dirt and used her aura along with a glyph to help it grow. It would be a while before it grew enough for Weiss to use. Fire was created in a similar manner, though she had to be especially careful so she wouldn't blow up empty agency on accident. Ice dust was the easiest to grow, especially considering that was the one she had the most of. Her earrings, which were made of dust, would act as seeds, and hopefully she could get a decent supply in a few months. Gravity, electricity, and hard light dust would be trickier, but not impossible. They would take longer, but Weiss would get it done. She was a Schnee after all. After watering the dust with her aura and special glyph, Weiss trained with Mirtanaster on the 3rd floor. Fighting the air and the occasional summon, she trained until you arrived with lunch. Sometimes Shinji, who turned out to be the hero known as Kamui Woods, would join them. The afternoon would be spent studying Japanese culture with Yu's help and researching whatever record companies were in the area. You didn't know about that last one. So do you have any future plans? Yu asked as she played with her phone as she laid on the couch. Weiss sat next to her, their legs crossing over each other. Strangely enough, she found herself growing closer towards the purple-eyed hero. HM? Weiss hummed as she scrolled through several record companies' websites. She wouldn't join any random one after all. Everything needed to be inspected, from their controversies to their financial status. You know, like school. I mean, I know technically you're older than most high schoolers, but physically you're well, you know. Yu's hands did a weird motion. Here you're a 14-year-old that's skipping school. I'm sure Detective Tsukachi could find a way to forge middle school records well enough to get you into a high school, but we should be planning ahead. Weiss felt a grimace form on her face. While she wanted to protest, Yu did have a point. Plus, she didn't want them to break any more laws. What options did Weiss have? She could go back to being a singer full-time, but that would be a waste. Weiss was trained her whole life to become the head of the SDC, and she spent just as many years learning how to fight and sing. Could she allow all of that to go to waste? I'm not saying that you should choose right now, just keep it in mind. The new school year starts in about 8 months. Yu suddenly smirked and showed Weiss her phone screen, showing a weird combination of a U and A. I'm sure that with your skills you could easily make it into UA with an arm tied behind your back. Ah yes, the closest thing that this world had to Beacon, and the 4 Huntsman Academies. Apparently, most if not all of the top heroes in Japan were alumni of UA High School. Did Weiss want to be a hero? She spent years honing her skills in order to become a huntress in training. But that didn't mean she was a hero. Did she even deserve to be a hero with all of her failures? Weiss was no one's hero. I see, Weiss said slowly, hardening the muscles in her face, forming the heiress smile as Young used to call it. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. Yu shrugged. I'm just saying. With your skills, I bet you could even break into the top 10 if you wanted. Maybe even hit number 1 or 2. Did Weiss want that? She didn't know anymore. Weiss saved the names of a few companies that caught her eye and placed the phone back in her pocket. Once she had her ID, she could go and explore the companies in person. Yu's phone started ringing. Hello? Yeah, we're home. Yu gave Weiss a glance. Oh, that's perfect. I was starting to wonder if you could even pull it off. She mouthed a name. Ah, it was Detective Tsukachi. You, huh? See you soon, bye-bye. You ended the call and went back to playing on her phone. Detective Tsukachi says that your ID is ready. You're now in the system. He said that he should be here in about an hour or so. Weiss felt that weird feeling in her stomach again. This was just another reminder that she would never see her friends again. Ah, okay. Weiss said evenly without any emotion. She got up slowly, untangling her legs from use. I'll be in my room. Could you please let me know when he arrives? You frowned, but nodded. Thank you. Weiss felt her body move automatically, and she soon found herself in her room, shutting the door behind her. Grabbing her pillows, she placed them in front of the crack where the door met the floor, blocking any sound from escaping. What would she do? Would she apply to UA and become one of this world's heroes? But that was just a job here, a meaningless title, one that wasn't earned. From what Weiss had gathered in the short time she had been here, most people became heroes for fame and money. It was the same back home with some huntsmen and huntresses, but at least they all had one thing in common: fighting to protect humanity and Faunaskyne from the Grim. What if she focused on her future singing career? But that wouldn't make her happy, even if her career exploded. Hiding her true self behind all of that fame and glamour. Weiss sat with her back leaning against the door. La la la. Weiss hummed softly as her mind raced. What would Yang do? Probably punch her way back home, or become a hero to fight villains. La la la. What would Blake do? She would probably be amazed at how different some quirks made people look, and fight for those who couldn't. Lala. What would Ruby do? This one was easy. Ruby would be a hero, trying to save as many people as she could. Gales of song, guide me through the storm. Weiss sang softly. What would she do? She wasn't young. She wasn't Blake. On the wings of a small, simple melody. She definitely wasn't Ruby, with her beautiful silver eyes. Words take flight and soar. They carry me. Weiss closed her eyes. A world we'll see, looking for a farewell, I pull the threads. Weiss opened her eyes, revealing silver ones staring straight back at her. Feeling tears form in the corner of her eyes, she wiped them away before they could fall. The vision of Ruby reached a hand out. A life without you I cannot accept. I can't tell that lie. Ruby's hand went through Weiss' pale ones. I can't let go. Weiss tried moving towards her partner, only for the vision to disappear, leaving her alone in the room. Taking several deep breaths as she sat on her knees, Weiss continued to pour out her feelings. But now that you're gone, I have to move on. Seems like everyone just smiles at the sun. Weiss' singing started to speed up slowly as she grabbed her head. But what about me? Everything here reminded her of them. Could she move on? Could she forget? Tell me, how will I know where I should go? Weiss panted as she paused. What did moving on really mean? Did that mean she should throw her past away and forget her friends? Forget Ruby? Or could she move on while remembering the good times she spent with them? They weren't here. But that didn't mean that Weiss was alone. As long as she had them in her heart and in her memories, they would still be here. Oh, Gales, you sing and guide me, Weiss sang loudly, releasing her head. I walk alone. There's more to life I have to know. What would her friends say if they saw her like this? Ruby, Blake, Young, John, Ren and Nora, would they be disappointed in her? Or would they tell her to embrace this change, to explore this new world that lied ahead of her? It's just me, lost so far away from home. Weiss felt the wind from the AC tickle her skin, as if attempting to give her a comforting touch. Alone I shut myself in, still the winds howl, they call and their voices lead me. The vision of Ruby appeared at the window, giving Weiss a wave with a smile. The rest of Team RWBY pull Weiss into a tight hug, their warmth heating up her cold heart. Gales of song, guide me through the storm. Let the melody lift me high. I'll be me, Weiss waved back, as a sad smile formed on her face. The vision disappeared once again, yet Weiss wasn't alone. Her friends would always be here, carefully stored inside her heart. Gales of song, please stay by my side. Weiss wasn't her team, she was her own person. But she would still do her best to make them proud. She will honor their memory. Winds of love, breathe into my life. She made her decision.